The copper pendulum of the grandfather clock in the hallway swung with a heavy, metallic rasp. Tock, tock, tock. It was 2:14 a.m. In the small library of the Vance estate, the only light came from a green glass banker's lamp on the corner secretary desk. Clara sat with her shoulders curved forward, her thumb rhythmically rubbing a small, smooth indentation in the cherry wood where the lacquer had worn away years ago. She picked up her glasses by the wire rims, breathed a thin mist of warmth onto the left lens, and wiped it with the hem of her oversized gray cardigan. The wool was scratchy against her skin, but it was familiar. It was the same cardigan she had worn to the grand ballroom of the Bellevue Hotel 4 hours earlier, where she had sat at table 14, the one tucked behind the towering floral arrangement of white lilies right next to the swinging double doors of the kitchen. From that table, through the gaps in the lilies, she had watched her brother Julian stand at the mahogany podium. He had looked magnificent in his bespoke tuxedo, the gold-plated Gavel and Scale award catch the light of 300 camera flashes. "I am deeply honored," Julian's voice had boomed through the high-end sound system, rich and dripping with effortless academic pedigree. "But truth be told, a trial lawyer is only as good as his preparation. And while I stand here in the spotlight, I must acknowledge the quiet work done in the shadows. My little sister Clara, my dedicated little assistant who helps keep the printer fed and does the typing. Clara, stand up." The spotlight had swept across the room, catching the white lilies first, then bathing Clara in a blinding hot glare. She hadn't stood up. She had simply offered a small, stiff nod. The partners at the front tables had chuckled warmly, appreciative of Julian's humility, before returning to their prime rib. Her mother, sitting at table 1, had turned just enough to mouth, "Smile, Clara. Don't be sour." Now, in the quiet of the library, the front door clicked open. Clara did not turn her head. She heard the wet slide of Julian's leather loafers on the marble foyer, followed by the heavy, sighing thud of his wool coat being dropped onto the antique bench. He didn't hang it up. He never did. The scent of rain, damp wool, and the sharp, piney top notes of his expensive cologne drifted into the library before he did. "You're still up," Julian said. It wasn't a question, nor was it particularly warm. He walked into the library, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone, his thumb flicking through what looked like a thread of congratulatory text messages. His silk tie was undone, hanging loosely around his unbuttoned collar like a discarded harness. "The Vance brief," Clara said, her voice quiet, almost swallowed by the heavy velvet drapes. "Right." Julian didn't look up from his screen. He reached into his leather briefcase, which he had set on the edge of the large mahogany desk in the center of the room, their father's desk. Without looking, he tossed a thick, pale blue folder toward Clara's smaller workspace. It slid across the polished wood, its corner striking her cold cup of Earl Grey tea. The dark liquid slished over the rim, forming a dark amber puddle on the desk. "I need you to run through Section 4 again," Julian muttered, his fingers still flying across his phone. "The senior partner wants to review the liability arguments by 9 tomorrow morning. I think the tone is a bit too dry. Punch it up. Make it sound like me." Clara looked at the dark tea pooling around the base of the porcelain cup. A tiny, slow-moving stream was crawling toward the edge of the blue folder. Internal calculation. If she pointed out the spilled tea, Julian would offer a half-hearted apology, grab a tissue, make a mess of wiping it, and then complain that she was being overly dramatic about a minor accident. If she told him that Section 4 was already legally airtight and that punching it up with his signature rhetorical flourishes would actually weaken the statutory defense, he would sigh. He would lean against the desk, look at her with that patronizing, brotherly pity, and remind her that she had never actually argued a case in front of a judge. He would say, "Theory is nice, Clara, but I know how the bench thinks." The energy required to explain the delicate balance of the statutory interpretation to him, 80%. The energy required to clean the tea, remain silent, and let him walk away, 15%. Clara picked up a tissue from the box beside her. She carefully dabbed at the amber puddle, watching the white paper turn brown as it drank the liquid. "Did you hear me?" Julian asked, his tone dropping into that smooth, slightly firmer register he used when a junior associate was slow to respond. He finally looked up from his phone, his eyes reflecting the soft green glow of her lamp. 9 o'clock, Clara. I have a radio interview at 10, and I want this signed off before I go on air." "I heard you," she said softly. "Great." He pocketed his phone, patted his pockets for his car keys, and turned toward the door. "Oh, and don't forget to adjust the formatting on the tables of authorities. The court clerk in the 3rd District is a stickler for the margins. Thanks, sis. You're a lifesaver." The door didn't slam when he left, but the latch clicked into place with a definitive, heavy snap. Clara sat in the silence that followed. The smell of his cologne lingered, thick and suffocating in the small room. She pulled the blue folder toward her. The cover was slightly damp at the edge from the spilled tea. She opened it. Inside were 42 pages of her own immaculate research, translated into Julian's loud, aggressive prose. In Section 4, he had inserted a paragraph of his own writing, a sweeping, emotional argument about corporate greed that sounded wonderful, but directly contradicted a Supreme Court precedent from 2018. If a judge read that paragraph, the entire defense would crumble under a motion to strike. Normally, Clara would spend the next 3 hours rewriting the section, smoothing over Julian's logical leaps and inserting the missing citations to protect him from his own ignorance. She would stay up until the birds began to chirp outside the window, ensuring his brilliance remained untarnished. Clara's hand hovered over the red editing pen lying on the desk. She picked it up. She unscrewed the cap. Then she set the pen down. She reached for a simple black ballpoint pen instead. Slowly, carefully, she corrected a single typographical error on page 3. A misplaced comma. She turned to page 12 and corrected a misspelled word. When she reached Section 4, she stared at the glaring legal error. Her eyes traced the arrogant, sweeping sentences Julian had written. She did not unscrew the red pen. She did not write a single note in the margin. She simply turned the page. Outside, the rain began to patter gently against the leaded glass windows, a soft, persistent scratching sound like fingernails on stone. Clara closed the blue folder, her fingers resting lightly on the damp, tea-stained cardboard of the cover. The morning light in the kitchen was the color of wet slate. It filtered through the leaded glass windows, throwing cold, diamond-shaped shadows across the white marble island. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the rhododendron bushes in the garden heavy and drooping with water. At 6:45 a.m., Clara stood before the copper kettle. This was her first physical routine of the day, a sequence of movements so ingrained in her muscles that she could perform them in absolute darkness. First, the silver-plated French press was rinsed with hot water to warm the glass. Next, exactly 3 scoops of dark roast beans were ground in the brass hand crank mill. For 3 years, Clara had timed the grind precisely to 45 seconds to ensure a coarse, even texture that would not slip past the metal mesh. Today, she did not time it. She turned the crank carelessly, the loud, jagged crunch-crunch of the beans echoing through the quiet house. When the kettle began its high-pitched, vibrating whistle, she did not wait the customary 30 seconds for the water to cool to the optimal brewing temperature. She poured the boiling water directly over the uneven grounds. The coffee bubbled violently, a bitter, burnt aroma rising with the steam, a dark froth spilling over the rim of the silver cylinder. She did not wipe it up. She left the dark brown smudge to dry on the polished silver. "Clara, is that the coffee?" The voice came from the archway leading to the dining room. Julian Vance entered, wrapping her emerald green silk kimono tighter around her waist. Her silver-streaked hair was already swept up into a neat, casual twist, secured with a tortoiseshell clip. She smelled of expensive rose water and the minty residue of her morning mouthwash. She didn't look at Clara. Her eyes were fixed on her iPad, her manicured thumbs scrolling through the local legal society's morning newsletter. "Yes, Mother," Clara said, her voice flat. "Make sure you use the small porcelain cups, the ones with the gold rim," Eleanor murmured, still scrolling. Julian's phone has been ringing since 6. Apparently, the firm's managing partner called him personally to congratulate him on the award. It's a very big day for him. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the marble island, tapping her screen. "Oh, look, they've posted the photograph from last night. Julian looks so striking next to the state senator. You can barely see the kitchen doors in the background. They cropped the frame beautifully." She paused, finally looking up. Her gaze swept over Clara's oversized cardigan, her unbrushed hair, and the faint blue shadows under her eyes. "Darling, did you sleep at all? You look so gray. You really must start taking better care of your skin. A woman's face is her calling card, even if she prefers to work behind the scenes." Eleanor reached out, her cool, soft fingers briefly patting Clara's cheek before she turned her attention back to her screen. "Did you finish Julian's filing? He was quite anxious about the Vance brief before he went to bed." Internal calculation. If Clara told her mother that she had stayed up until 3 a.m. correcting Julian's sloppy formatting, but had purposely left a gaping, catastrophic logical error in the core argument, Eleanor would not understand the legal significance. She would simply accuse Clara of being petty or uncooperative. She would remind Clara that the family name was on the firm's masthead, and that Julian's success was, by extension, Clara's security. She would say, "We all have our roles to play, Clara." The energy required to explain the concept of professional self-sabotage, 95%. The energy required to offer a mild, compliant lie, 5%. "It's on the console in the foyer," Clara said, "exactly as he left it." "Good girl," Eleanor sighed with relief, her focus returning to her screen. "I don't know what he would do without you to tidy up after him. He's always been the big picture thinker. He gets that from your father. The details, well, the details are for the support staff, aren't they?" A heavy step on the stairs cut through the quiet. Julian descended, already fully dressed in a charcoal suit, his silk tie knotted in a perfect, thick double Windsor. He looked slightly flushed, his eyes bright with the residual adrenaline of his victory and a morning spent answering congratulatory phone calls. He didn't walk into the kitchen. He stopped in the hallway, his leather briefcase already open on the console table. "Mom, have you seen my keys?" Julian called out, his voice sharp and impatient. "They're on the silver tray by the door, sweetheart," Eleanor called back, her voice instantly softening into a warm, melodic register she reserved almost exclusively for him. "Clara just made coffee. Have a cup before you go." "No time," Julian muttered. The rustle of paper echoed from the hallway as he rifled through the console. "Where's the folder? Clara, did you put the Vance brief out?" Clara walked to the kitchen threshold, her hands wrapped around her own mug of burnt coffee. She watched him. He was standing by the mahogany console, his back to her. He had found the blue folder. He didn't open it. He didn't read a single line of the 42 pages she had spent weeks crafting. He simply shoved the damp-edged folder into his leather briefcase and zipped it shut with a swift, decisive slide of the brass zipper. "Got it," Julian said. He grabbed his keys from the tray, the metal jingling loudly in the quiet hall. He finally turned, his eyes brushing past Clara as if she were a piece of familiar furniture. "Thanks, Clara. I'll let you know what the senior partner says. If he has notes, I'll email them to you this afternoon. Keep your phone close." He didn't wait for a reply. He opened the heavy oak front door, the cool, damp morning air rushing into the warm hallway for a brief second before the door clicked shut behind him. The sound of his car engine cranking to life in the driveway was a low, distant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Clara stood in the doorway, the mug of coffee warm against her palms. The liquid inside was dark, bitter, and slightly cloudy from the overheated grounds. "He's just so driven," Eleanor said from the kitchen, her voice filled with a quiet, maternal awe. "He has that spark. You can't teach that, you know. Some people are just born to be in the light." Clara took a slow sip of her coffee. The bitterness coat her tongue, harsh and unyielding. She did not look at her mother. She looked at the small, empty space on the silver tray where Julian's keys had been, and then at the dark, dried smudge of coffee on the silver French press. The clock in the hallway struck 7:30 a.m. Talk, talk, talk. In exactly 1 hour and 30 minutes, Julian would open his briefcase in the corner office of the senior partner. He would present the brief. He would take credit for every word. And for the first time in his life, he would be completely, utterly on his own. The dishwater had gone lukewarm, a grayish-white film of grease from the morning's soft-boiled eggs floating on the surface of the foam. Clara submerged Eleanor's gold-rimmed porcelain cup, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of the handle beneath the soapy water. This was her second routine. The porcelain could not go into the dishwasher. The high heat would strip the gold leaf from the edges over time. It required a soft, yellow sponge, a light touch, and a thorough rinse in tepid water, followed by immediate drying with a crisp linen cloth to prevent water spots. Her father had bought this set in Munich 30 years ago, and for as long as Clara could remember, she was the only one trusted to wash it. Julian had chipped a saucer when he was 12 and had never been asked to touch them again. The brass faucet squeaked when she turned it, a high metallic pitch that vibrated in her teeth. She held the cup under the thin stream of water, watching the soap slide away, leaving the pristine white clay beneath. From the dining room, Eleanor's voice carried through the open archway. She was on the phone, her tone bright, performative, and elevated. "Oh, Beatrice, you should have seen him," Eleanor said, the rustle of her silk kimono accompanying her footsteps as she paced the hardwood floor. "He was absolutely magnetic. The entire room was hanging on his every word. And today, of course, is the interview on WNRT. Yes, 10 o'clock. It's starting in just a few minutes. I've got the radio set up in the breakfast nook." Clara placed the clean cup on the linen cloth and picked up another. She did not look toward the dining room. "Oh, you know how Julian is," Eleanor continued, her laugh light and airy. "He didn't sleep a wink. He was in the library until 3 in the morning, perfecting the Vance filing. I told him he's burning the candle at both ends, but he's simply so passionate about the law. He refused to go to sleep until every single sentence was perfect. He drafted the entire liability section from scratch, you know. He's just tireless. Internal calculation. If Clara walked into the dining room right now, holding her laptop, and showed Eleanor the document properties of the Vance brief, revealing that the metadata recorded 48 hours of drafting by user C_Vance and exactly 12 minutes of editing by user J_Vance, her mother would not look at the screen. She would look at Clara's face. She would see the dark circles under Clara's eyes and say, "Clara, please don't be difficult. Julian represents this family. Why must you always try to diminish his accomplishments?" The energy required to defend her own authorship, 88%. The energy required to let Eleanor weave her fiction to Aunt Beatrice, 0%. Clara squeezed the sponge. A stream of cold, soapy water ran down her wrist, disappearing into the sleeve of her gray cardigan. She said nothing. A sharp static hiss echoed from the breakfast nook as Eleanor turned on the antique tabletop radio. After a moment of tuning, the smooth, professional voice of the local public radio host filled the kitchen, followed by Julian's deep, resonant baritone. "Thank you, Sarah. It's wonderful to be here," Julian said over the airwaves. Even through the small, tinny speaker, his voice carried the effortless confidence of a man who had never been told he was wrong. "We're speaking this morning with Julian Vance," the host said, "recently awarded the gavel and scale for his work in appellate advocacy. Mr. Vance, your firm is currently handling the Vance versus Sterling corporate liability case, which is set to go before the appellate court next week. There's a lot of talk about your strategy in this filing." "Yes, well," Julian said, and Clara could practically hear the handsome, modest smile he always wore when receiving praise. "The Vance case is about accountability. In our brief, which I delivered to the senior partner just this morning, we've taken a very firm stand on the statutory interpretation. I personally spent the late hours of last night refining our core arguments. I wanted to ensure that the language was not just legally sound, but morally clear." In the kitchen, Clara picked up the linen cloth. She began to dry the porcelain cup with slow, circular motions. Talk, talk, talk. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to sync with the steady, rhythmic wiping of her hand. "It's an ambitious approach," the host noted. "Some legal scholars suggest that pushing too hard on the statutory definition of liability might backfire, especially under the current bench. How did you account for that in your brief?" "We've built an airtight wall, Sarah," Julian said, his voice brimming with a comforting, almost dismissive certainty. "We've cited the historical precedent beautifully. There's no room for the opposition to wiggle out. I'm entirely confident the court will see the logic of our position." Clara stopped drying. She looked down at her hands. The airtight wall Julian was referring to was Section 4, the very section she had left uncorrected, the section where Julian had proudly inserted his own emotional rhetoric, completely unaware that the 2018 precedent he had cited had been overturned in a quiet en banc ruling 3 years ago. It was a basic, catastrophic oversight. A first-year law student would have caught it. Clara had caught it in 5 seconds. But Julian hadn't read the final draft. He had simply zipped it into his briefcase. Clara walked out of the kitchen, leaving the damp linen cloth on the counter. She climbed the stairs to the library, her steps silent on the carpeted risers. The library was quiet, smelling of Julian's lingering cologne and the faint, dusty scent of old calfskin law books. On her small secretary desk, her laptop screen was still glowing in the dim light. She sat down. She opened the firm's shared network drive. Normally, her morning routine involved checking Julian's calendar, cross-referencing his court appearances with the local docket, and flagging any potential scheduling conflicts. She would also monitor his professional email inbox, drafting quick, polished responses to clients that he would later copy, paste, and send under his own name. Clara moved her cursor to the top right corner of the screen. She clicked on the settings icon for the shared calendar. She unchecked the box that synced Julian's schedule with her own. Next, she opened the remote desktop application. She clicked on his profile, the one she had kept active on her screen for 3 years, allowing her to quietly fix his formatting errors and upload his missing exhibits in real time. She hovered over the button labeled Log Out. A soft chime came from her phone on the desk. It was an email notification. She picked up the phone. It was an automated alert from the firm's document management system. Document Vance_V_Sterling_final_draft.pdf has been locked for editing by Arthur Pendleton, Senior Partner. Clara looked at the timestamp on the alert, 10:14 a.m. On the radio downstairs, Julian's voice was still talking about his airtight wall, his words flowing smoothly, wrapping the listeners in the warm illusion of his brilliance. Clara turned back to her laptop screen. With a steady, deliberate motion of her finger, she clicked Log Out. The screen blinked, the shared drive disappearing, replaced by a cold, blank login prompt. She closed the laptop lid. The soft clack of the plastic closing was the only sound in the room. The blade of the small paring knife sank into the flesh of the plum tomato with a soft, wet give. Clara pressed down, her movements measured and deliberate. The steel slid through the red skin, parting it into thin, translucent discs. On the wooden cutting board, a small pool of pale yellow juice and flat, tear-shaped seeds spread outward, slowly soaking into the grain of the wood. This was her afternoon routine. Every day at 1:15 p.m., she made herself a sandwich. 2 slices of day-old sourdough, a thin layer of salted butter, the tomato slices, and a single leaf of romaine lettuce. She did not use the expensive deli meats her mother bought for Julian. She preferred the simplicity of things that did not require cooking or presentation. She used a butter knife with a tarnished silver handle, the one with the family crest fading near the bolster, to spread a dollop of sharp Dijon mustard. The vinegary, stinging aroma rose into her nose, a sharp contrast to the damp, heavy air of the kitchen. The brass-belled ring of the rotary telephone in the hallway shattered the quiet. It rang twice before the rustle of Eleanor's silk kimono signaled her approach. The Vance family kept the heavy, black Western Electric model on the hallway table because their father had believed that modern cordless phones lacked gravity. "Vance residence," Eleanor said, her voice instantly dropping into her poised, elegant social register. Clara did not stop spreading the mustard. She smoothed it over the crust, ensuring every corner of the dry bread was covered. "Oh, Julian, darling!" Eleanor's tone shifted, the artificial warmth giving way to a sudden, thin strain of anxiety. "Yes, I'm here. What is it?" "Slow down, sweetheart. You're speaking so quickly." Clara took a bite of the raw end of a tomato slice. It tasted of earth and cold rain. "What do you mean Arthur didn't sign it?" Eleanor's voice had grown quieter, more guarded. She had stepped closer to the library door, her footsteps hesitant. But you told him you spent all night on it." "Yes, of course. Did he say what the issue was?" There was a long silence. Through the kitchen archway, Clara could see the reflection of her mother's green silk robe in the gilt-framed mirror of the hallway. Eleanor was twisting the coiled black telephone cord around her index finger, pulling it tight until her nail bed turned white. "The 2018 precedent?" Eleanor repeated, the words sounding foreign and heavy on her tongue. Julian, you know I don't understand the technicalities of the appellate court." "Well, where is Clara?" "She's in the kitchen. She's just making lunch." A pause. The muffled, frantic crackle of Julian's voice erupted from the earpiece, loud enough to carry down the hall as a tiny, angry buzz. All right, Eleanor said, her voice rising in a rare moment of maternal panic. Let me ask her. Stay on the line. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later. Her perfect composure had frayed. A single strand of hair had escaped her tortoiseshell clip, hanging limp against her cheek, and her lips were pressed into a thin, pale line. She did not look at the sandwich on the cutting board. She looked directly at Clara's eyes, her gaze sharp with a sudden, unacknowledged dependency. Clara, Eleanor said, her breathing shallow. Julian is on the phone. He's at the office. He says there's a misunderstanding with Arthur Pendleton. Arthur is refusing to sign off on the Vance filing. He says there's a citation error in Section 4, some ruling from 3 years ago that contradicts their position. She took a step closer to the marble island, her hands gripping her iPad as if it were a shield. Julian says his remote desktop connection is down. He can't access his research files from his phone, and his secretary is out on lunch. He needs you to log into his account, find the correct citation, and email it to him immediately. He has a meeting with Arthur in 20 minutes. Internal calculation. Clara's laptop was sitting upstairs, closed. Logging in would take 40 seconds. Finding the en banc ruling that overturned Julian's citation would take another 60. She could draft a quick, elegant correction that Julian could present to Arthur as a clerical oversight, saving his reputation before the afternoon partners' meeting. But doing so would cost her the quiet territory she had claimed over the last 12 hours. It would reinforce the invisible, unbreakable boundary of her role, the silent engine that kept the Vance name polished. The energy required to restore the status quo and keep Julian safe, 90%. The energy required to let him explain a fatal, unresearched error to a senior partner who valued precision above all else, 0%. Clara picked up her glass of water. She took a slow sip, letting the cold liquid settle in her throat before she spoke. The firm's server must be down, Clara said softly. I tried to log in earlier to check some formatting, and the system wouldn't accept my credentials. It happens on Tuesdays sometimes. They do the security updates. Eleanor stared at her, her eyes widening slightly. Security updates? But can't you bypass it? Surely you have a backup of his files on your computer. No, Clara lied, her voice even, almost conversational. Julian asked me to delete the local copies last week to save hard drive space. He said everything should remain on the secure cloud. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. But he has 20 minutes, Clara. Arthur is a very difficult man. You know how he is about the details. If Julian looks unprepared, I'm sure Julian will find a way to explain it, Clara said. She picked up her sandwich, the dry sourdough crust crunching softly under her fingers. He's the big-picture thinker, after all. He has that spark. Eleanor stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her mouth slightly open. For a brief, terrifying second, a shadow of realization seemed to cross her face, a sudden, cold awareness that the invisible tap water of Clara's labor had stopped flowing. But the thought was too heavy, too disruptive to her world, and she quickly pushed it away. I have to tell him, Eleanor whispered. She turned back toward the hallway, her silk robe whispering against the floorboards as she rushed back to the black telephone. Clara took a bite of her sandwich. The mustard was hot, burning her nasal passages with a sharp, cleansing heat. She chewed slowly, listening to the frantic, hushed tones of her mother's voice down the hall and the steady, indifferent tick-tock of the grandfather clock. The smell of ammonia was sharp enough to sting the back of Clara's throat. She poured a nickel-sized puddle of pink brass polish onto a scrap of old flannel, the chemical fumes rising in a cold, invisible vapor. Slowly, she began to rub the cloth against the tarnished brass pull of the library's lower filing cabinet. It was her third physical routine of the day. The cabinet held the physical archives of her father's early estate cases, files that had not been opened in 15 years, yet the brass hardware was expected to remain immaculate. She worked the cloth in tight, rhythmic circles. Under the friction, the dull, greasy black oxidation began to dissolve, transferring onto the gray flannel as a dark, oily smudge, revealing the cold, bright yellow metal beneath. She liked the resistance of the metal. It didn't bend, it didn't complain, it only yielded when enough pressure was applied. The front door downstairs rattled in its frame. It wasn't the usual light click of Julian's return, but a hard, heavy impact that sent a dull vibration up through the floorboards of the library. Then came the dry, hollow thud of his leather briefcase being dropped directly onto the marble foyer floor, not placed on the console, but discarded like a piece of refuse. Clara did not stop polishing. She shifted her thumb to a clean spot on the flannel, added another drop of polish, and began on the second drawer pull. The cast-iron heating grate in the corner of the library floor was an old Victorian intake. Its ornate scrollwork opened directly to the ceiling of the formal parlor downstairs. Through the black metal slats, the muffled, sharp rising and falling of voices drifted up, as clear as if they were standing in the room with her. "He didn't just reject it, Mother." Julian's voice was stripped of its smooth, radio-frequency charm. It was thin, reedy, and vibrating with a tight, defensive anger. "He read Section 4 aloud, in front of the entire litigation committee. He asked me if I had outsourced my research to an undergraduate." "Oh, Julian, surely not." Eleanor's voice was a soothing, frantic flutter. "Arthur has always had a dramatic streak. Your father always said Arthur was a frustrated theater actor." "It wasn't theater," Julian snapped, the sound of his heavy pacing echoing on the hardwood below. Squeak, squeak, squeak. He had the 2021 en banc ruling printed out on his desk. He threw it at me. He asked me how I could cite a precedent that was explicitly overturned 3 years ago. I stood there like an idiot, trying to explain that it was a clerical error, a draft version that had been uploaded by mistake. "Well, did you tell him about the server issue?" Eleanor asked. "That Clara couldn't log in to verify the final edits?" "Of course I did," Julian's voice cracked slightly. "And do you know what Arthur said? He said, if your administrative assistant is the only one keeping you from committing malpractice, perhaps she should have her name on the door instead of yours." He gave me 48 hours to submit a completely rewritten Section 4, or he's handing the Vance lead to Miller. Clara's hand paused on the brass handle. Internal calculation. The litigation committee met on the second Tuesday of every month. The senior partners were already skeptical of Julian's rapid rise, viewing him as a creature of public relations rather than legal substance. If Clara downstairs now took the blame for the citation and offered to spend the next 48 hours drafting a brilliant, flawless correction, she could still save his position. Julian would apologize to her in private, a quick, patronizing, "I was just stressed, Clara, you know how it is," and her mother would buy her another expensive silk scarf she would never wear. The family illusion would remain whole. But the tarnish on the flannel cloth in her hand was thick, black, and heavy. It had taken years to accumulate, and it required effort to strip away. The energy required to restore his reputation, 95%. The energy required to continue rubbing the brass pull until it shined, 5%. Clara pressed her thumb back against the metal. She resumed her slow, circular motions. "Where is she?" Julian's voice was closer now, moving toward the hallway. "Is she still upstairs? I need her to get on the phone with the IT director. I don't care if the servers are down for maintenance. They need to grant her local admin access to my profile immediately. I can't rewrite 20 pages of statutory analysis by myself by Thursday." "She's in the library, darling," Eleanor said, her voice trailing behind him. "But please, don't raise your voice. She's had a very long day and she wasn't feeling well earlier." The heavy, rapid thud of Julian's leather-soled shoes began to ascend the stairs. Each step was loud, a physical declaration of his frustration. Clara did not look toward the library door. She kept her eyes on the brass pull, watching the pink polish dry into a white, chalky film under her thumb. She took a clean, dry corner of the flannel and began to buff the chalk away, leaving the metal beneath so bright it reflected the green glass of her desk lamp as a distorted, glowing smear. The footsteps reached the landing outside the library. The heavy oak door sat slightly ajar, a thin sliver of yellow light from the hallway cutting across the carpet. Julian's shadow fell across the threshold, blocking the light. He stood there, his chest rising and falling with shallow, angry breaths. His tie was completely gone now, his collar turned inward, and his hair, usually lacquered into place, was slightly disheveled. He opened his mouth to speak, his hand resting on the doorframe. But as he looked into the dim, quiet library, his eyes fell upon Clara. She was sitting quietly on her low stool, her fingers stained black with tarnish and pink with polish, her gray cardigan pulled tight around her. The absolute stillness of the room, the sharp, medicinal smell of the ammonia, and the cold, indifferent rhythm of her hand, buffing the brass, seemed to act as a physical barrier. The words seemed to catch in his throat. For the first time in his life, he was met not with anxious compliance or a hurried offer of help, but with a profound, hollow silence. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping into a lower, less certain register. "The servers, are they still down?" Clara slowly turned her head. She looked at him, her expression empty of anger, empty of resentment, empty of any recognizable emotion at all. "Yes, Julian," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the rustle of the flannel. "They're still down." He stared at her for 3 long seconds, waiting for her to say something else, waiting for her to ask what Arthur had said, or to offer to look at his physical notes, or to promise to stay up all night. She did none of those things. She simply turned her attention back to the filing cabinet, finding a third tarnished brass handle, and began to rub. Julian's hand slowly slid off the doorframe. He did not come into the room. He turned, his steps slow and strangely hesitant as he walked down the hall toward his own bedroom, the door closing behind him with a quiet, hollow click. The shell of the soft-boiled egg gave way under the gentle, flat strike of Clara's silver spoon. Crack! A single, clean fracture split the pale, chalky surface. With meticulous care, Clara slid the tip of her thumb beneath the hairline break, catching the thin, rubbery membrane beneath. She peeled it back in one continuous, spiraling ribbon. The damp white of the egg emerged, perfectly smooth, reflecting the weak, watery light of Wednesday morning. This was her physical routine. Every Wednesday at 7:45 a.m., she sat at the end of the long mahogany dining table, her breakfast arranged with geometric precision, the egg in its porcelain cup, a single slice of dry rye toast on a small side plate, and a silver salt cellar no larger than a thimble. She dipped her fingertips into the salt cellar, feeling the sharp, granular coldness of the coarse sea salt against her skin. She sprinkled a few crystals onto the egg, the faint sulphurous aroma rising into the cool air of the room. Across the table, Julian sat behind a towering barricade of physical books. He had not slept. The dark circles under his eyes were no longer faint shadows. They had bruised into deep purple hollows that made his sharp cheekbones look jagged. The charcoal gray suit jacket he had worn the day before was thrown over the back of a neighboring chair, and his white shirt was rumpled, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. Around his plate lay 4 heavy, leather-bound volumes of the Federal Reporter, their pages bristling with yellow sticky notes. A cold cup of black coffee sat near his elbow, a thin, greasy film forming over the surface of the liquid. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were bloodshot, scanning a page of dense legal text as his finger dragged down the margin, stopping, retreating, then tracing the same line again. "The restatement of torts," Julian muttered, his voice dry and hoarse. He didn't look up. "Clara, do you know where the supplementary volume for the 3rd District is? The one with the regional amendments?" Clara took a small bite of her toast. The dry grain crunched loudly in the quiet room. "The library shelves are organized alphabetically by subject," she said softly. "The torts section is on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, next to the window." "It's not there," Julian said, his voice tightening. He finally looked up, his gaze intense, desperate, and slightly accusatory. "I looked. I spent 2 hours in the basement files last night, too. There's a red binder, the one from the 2021 Symposium on Joint and Several Liability. You had it on your desk last month." Indirect interaction. Julian was not asking her to help him. He was asking her to locate a physical object, pretending it was a matter of simple housekeeping rather than a critical deficit in his own research. He wanted the information without having to acknowledge that she was the one who had compiled it. Clara took a sip of her lukewarm water. Internal calculation. The red binder was currently sitting in the bottom drawer of her secretary desk, tucked beneath a stack of old utility bills. It contained the exact annotations, case summaries, and cross-references Julian needed to rebuild Section 4 of the Vance brief. If she told him where it was, he would have his answer in 30 seconds. He would meet Arthur Pendleton's Thursday deadline, and the firm's partners would congratulate him on his swift recovery. If she did not tell him, he would have to spend the next 8 hours manually searching the public access terminals, sorting through hundreds of unindexed state appellate decisions, a task he had not performed since his first semester of law school, and one he had always outsourced to her. The energy required to surrender the binder and ease his panic, 100%. The energy required to let him search the dark basement, 0%. "I haven't seen it," Clara said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any helpful inflection. "Perhaps you left it at the office." Julian's jaw clenched. He stared at her, his fingers tightening against the edge of the heavy leather volume until his knuckles turned yellow. "I didn't leave it at the office, Clara. I'm not irresponsible. It was here. Everything is always here." Before he could say more, Eleanor entered the dining room. She was fully dressed in a tailored navy blue knit suit, her pearls resting against her collarbone, but her expression was taut. She carried a silver tray with a fresh pot of coffee, her eyes darting anxiously between her 2 children as she set it down. "Julian, sweethearted, you must eat something," Eleanor said, her voice carrying that strained, cheerful pitch that usually preceded a family argument. She poured a fresh cup, the dark, steaming liquid smelling of hazelnut. "You've been up all night. You can't possibly go into the office looking like this. Clara, dear, can't you go down to the basement and double-check? You have such an eye for where things get misplaced." "The basement is damp, Mother," Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly even. "The dust triggers my allergies. I have to finish cleaning the silver cabinet in the parlor today." "The silver?" Julian's voice rose, a sharp, ugly crack of frustration escaping his throat. "You're worried about the silver? I have 24 hours to save the biggest filing of my career, and you're polishing forks?" Clara set her spoon down. The silver clinked against the edge of the porcelain cup with a tiny ringing sound that seemed to hang in the air long after it stopped. "The forks have to be polished every spring, Julian," she said, looking him directly in the eyes. "Otherwise, they tarnish. You're the one who always insists on using the sterling when the senior partners come for dinner." Julian opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He looked at Eleanor, as if appealing to a higher authority, but Eleanor only looked helpless, her fingers nervously adjusting the pearls at her throat. "We all have our duties," Clara added softly, taking another small bite of her toast. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 8 a.m. Talk, talk, talk. Julian pushed his chair back with a harsh, grating screech against the parquet floor. He gathered 3 of the heavy volumes, nearly knocking over his cold coffee in the process, and shoved them into his arms. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out of the room, his heavy, uneven steps echoing down the hall before the front door clicked shut, leaving the dining room in a cold, suffocating silence. Eleanor stood by the sideboard, her hands still resting on the silver coffee pot. She looked at Clara, her expression a mix of confusion, annoyance, and a faint, creeping dread she couldn't quite name. "He's just so under pressure, Clara," Eleanor whispered, as if trying to convince herself. "He needs us right now." Clara did not answer. She picked up her butter knife and began to scrape a tiny, dried yellow speck of egg yolk from the edge of her plate, her movements slow, quiet, and entirely her own. The silver fork felt cold and heavy in Clara's palm. She dipped the tip of a stiff horsehair brush into the jar of gray, chalky polishing cream, the pungent, sulphurous smell of the compound rising to mingle with the damp air of the butler's pantry. With precise, practiced movements, she began to work the cream into the crevices of the fork's handle. The pattern was a heavy, ornate Baroque style, filled with deep scrolls and miniature leaf clusters where decades of dust and tarnish like to hide. The brush made a dry, rhythmic shuck-shuck sound against the metal. As she scrubbed, the gray cream turned a dark, greasy purple, drawing the black oxidation out from the silver's pores. This was her afternoon routine. Every spring, she spent 3 days in the windowless pantry, sitting on a high stool beneath a single bare bulb, cleaning all 120 pieces of the family's formal sterling. No one else did it. If left to Eleanor, the silver would be sent to a professional service that used harsh chemical dips, which Clara knew would eventually dull the crisp edges of the engraving. She turned the fork over, her thumb pressing a soft flannel cloth into the times, buffing away the dried cream to reveal the blinding, liquid mirror of the clean metal beneath. The telephone on the pantry wall rang. It was a short, sharp chime, distinct from the grand brass bells of the main hallway phone. This was the internal line, connected to the carriage house and the private office. Clara did not stretch out her hand. She finished buffing the final tine of the fork, set it gently on a clean linen sheet, and then reached for the receiver. "Vance residence," she said. "Clara? Oh, thank goodness." The voice on the other end was Penelope, the firm's senior administrative assistant. Penelope had been with Pendleton and Vance for 12 years. She was a meticulous, patient woman who rarely lost her composure. But today, her breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. "Clara, I'm calling from the copy room. I had to close the door. Is Julian there?" "No," Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly level. "He left for the office at 8. "He's here," Penelope whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But he's in a complete state, Clara. He's been in Arthur's office for 45 minutes. I can hear them through the double doors." Arthur is demanding the original research files for the Vance appellate strategy, the physical folders from 3 years ago that contain the local district exceptions. Julian swore they were scanned and uploaded to the cloud, but they aren't in his folder. He's blaming the IT department, but the director says nothing has been deleted. Penelope paused, a desperate, pleading note creeping into her tone. Clara, please, do you know where those files are? Julian is shouting at everyone. He's accusing us of losing his work. If we don't find those scanned PDFs before the litigation committee meets again tomorrow morning, Arthur is going to assign the case to Miller. I've never seen him this angry. Indirect interaction. Penelope was not calling to ask for Clara's help with the research. She was calling because she knew, through years of quiet observation, that Clara was the one who actually maintained the firm's memory. She was treating Clara as a repository of Julian's missing competence. Clara looked at the silver fork resting on the white linen. Her fingers were stained with the dark purple residue of the polish. Internal calculation. The files Penelope was looking for were not on the firm's shared network. 3 years ago, when Julian had carelessly forgotten to renew the firm's cloud storage subscription, Clara had quietly backed up all of his active case folders onto a private encrypted drive that she paid for out of her own meager allowance. She had never transferred them back because Julian had never bothered to ask where they were. He simply assumed they reappeared on his screen through some magical administrative automated process. She could log into her private drive, download the 5 gigabytes of scanned local exceptions, and email them to Penelope in less than 3 minutes. Julian's panic would subside. Penelope would be spared his wrath. The firm's hierarchy would remain undisturbed. But every time she intervened to absorb the shock of Julian's failures, she reinforced the very structure that kept her hidden in the butler's pantry, polishing his silverware. The energy required to retrieve the files and save his career, 90%. The energy required to let him face the consequences of his own administrative neglect, 0%. I'm sorry, Penelope, Clara said, her voice soft and steady. I don't have access to Julian's active folders anymore. He asked me to clear my local backups last week to protect client confidentiality. If they aren't on the firm's cloud, I wouldn't know where to look. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Clara could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the high-speed copier in the background of the office, miles away. You don't have them? Penelope's voice sounded hollow, drained of hope. But Julian was so certain. He told Arthur that you handled the filing. Julian is the lead counsel, Clara said, her tone devoid of any sarcasm, which only made the statement feel more cold and absolute. He manages the files. I'm sure he simply misplaced them in his personal directory. Oh God, Penelope whispered. All right, thank you, Clara. I have to go. He's coming out of the office. The line went dead with a soft click. Clara hung up the receiver. She stood in the quiet of the pantry for a moment, the heavy smell of the polish filling her lungs. Clara? Eleanor was standing in the doorway of the pantry. She had heard the phone ring from the kitchen. She looked at Clara's stained hands, her eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and growing dread. Was that the office? Eleanor asked, her voice tight. Was that about Julian? Yes, Clara said. She picked up a tarnished silver spoon and dipped her brush back into the gray cream. Penelope was looking for some older files. Did you find them? Eleanor took a step into the small pantry, her knit suit rustling. Clara, this is serious. Julian called me 10 minutes ago. He sounded frantic. He said Arthur is being completely unreasonable. Surely you can do something to help him. Clara began to work the brush into the bowl of the spoon, the dry shuck-shuck sound filling the small room again. I told her I don't have them, Mother, Clara said, not looking up. The files are Julian's responsibility. But you always know where things are. Eleanor's voice rose. a sharp, impatient edge breaking through her maternal poise. "You've always taken care of his paperwork. Why are you being so difficult today? It's just a few files." Clara stopped brushing. She looked up at her mother, her expression perfectly serene under the harsh glare of the bare bulb. "You told me this morning that we all have our roles, Mother," Clara said softly. "You said the details are for the support staff. I'm just the support staff. And right now, my duty is to ensure the family sterling is polished before the senior partners arrive next week. I wouldn't want to neglect my responsibilities." Eleanor stared at her, her lips parting slightly. She opened her mouth to argue, to demand, to find some way to force Clara back into her familiar, compliant shape. But as she looked at Clara's calm, unblinking eyes, she found nothing to latch onto. There was no anger to fight, no resentment to soothe. There was only a cold, smooth wall of absolute indifference. Without another word, Eleanor turned and walked out of the pantry, her heels clicking rapidly on the hardwood as she retreated toward the front of the house. Clara looked down at the spoon in her hand. She wiped away a small patch of the gray polish, revealing the bright, flawless silver beneath. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 2 p.m. Tock, tock, tock. The mandolin slicer made a sharp, rhythmic shup, shup sound against the wooden cutting board. Clara held the green cucumber by its stalk, sliding it down the stainless steel track with a steady, unhurried pressure. With each pass, a paper-thin, translucent green disc fell into the white ceramic bowl beneath. The watery green scent of the freshly cut vegetable rose into the air, clean and cool, instantly cutting through the lingering, heavy smell of silver polish that still clung to the corners of the kitchen. This was her evening routine. Every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m., she prepared a simple cucumber and red onion salad, dressed with white vinegar and a pinch of sugar. It was a dish her father had liked because it was crisp and quiet to eat. She sliced a small red onion, her eyes stinging slightly as the sharp, sulphury vapor hit her face. She did not wipe her eyes. She let the tears pool in the corners, cold and heavy, before they slid down her cheeks, leaving thin, clean tracks through the dust of the silver polish on her skin. The heavy front door opened, followed by the dull, familiar rattle of the umbrella stand in the hall. Julian's footsteps were different tonight. They lacked the rhythmic, confident click-clack of his usual stride. Instead, they were heavy, dragging, and slightly uneven, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. He didn't go to the parlor, nor did he head upstairs to change. He walked straight into the dining room, the rustle of loose papers accompanying his movements. Through the kitchen archway, Clara saw him sink into the chair at the end of the long mahogany table. He didn't take off his suit jacket. He simply leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished wood, his face buried in his open palms. Eleanor was by his side in an instant, her green silk kimono rustling as she hovered over him. "Julian," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with tension. "What did Arthur say? Did you find the files?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He let his hands slide down his face, pulling the skin of his cheeks down until his bloodshot eyes looked raw in the dim light of the dining room chandelier. On the table before him lay a stack of hastily printed, uncollated case law PDFs, the pages curling at the corners. "Arthur spent the afternoon in Miller's office," Julian said, his voice flat, drained of all its usual resonance. "Miller had a complete file on the 3rd District exceptions. He's had his paralegal working on it for 3 days. Arthur told me that if I don't have a fully reconstructed, legally sound Section 4 on his desk by 9 tomorrow morning, he's naming Miller as lead counsel on the Vance appeal." "But that's your case," Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. "You won the award, Julian. They can't just hand it to Miller. It's public." "The award was for past advocacy, Mom," Julian said, his voice rising in a sharp defensive edge. "Arthur doesn't care about the award. He cares about the docket. He said my brief was unprofessional. He said the citation error made us look like amateurs." He turned his head toward the kitchen archway. He couldn't see Clara from where he sat, but he knew she was there. The rhythmic chirp of the mandolin slicer had stopped, replaced by the quiet slosh of vinegar being poured into the ceramic bowl. "I don't understand it," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly into the kitchen. He was speaking to Eleanor, but his eyes were fixed on the empty space of the archway. "I had those files. I know I did. Someone must have altered the network directories. Or someone deliberately neglected to back up the local cache before the server update." Indirect interaction. He was framing his own administrative failure as a conspiracy, a technical glitch, or a quiet act of sabotage, hoping to bait Clara into defending her work. He wanted her to walk into the dining room, present her laptop, and prove her competence by handing him the files. Clara picked up a wooden spoon. She began to toss the cucumber slices in the vinegar, the sound of the wet vegetables clicking against the ceramic bowl quiet and steady in the silence of the house. Internal calculation. Julian was offering her an opening. If she walked into the room, showed him the private drive where the 2021 dockets were stored, and spent the next 12 hours writing his brief, he would be saved. He would keep the lead on the Vance case. The family would celebrate, and her mother would praise her quiet dedication once again. But she had spent 30 years of her life as the invisible foundation of his success. If she stepped back into that foundation now, she would never get out. The energy required to save him and return to the shadows, 90%. The energy required to let him explain his empty briefcase to Arthur Pendleton in the morning, 0%. Clara placed the wooden spoon on the counter. She picked up the white ceramic bowl of cucumber salad and walked into the dining room. She did not look at Julian's bloodshot eyes, nor did she look at Eleanor's pale, anxious face. She set the salad bowl down in the center of the table, exactly halfway between them. "Dinner is ready," Clara said softly. Julian stared at the green, translucent cucumber slices floating in the white vinegar. "Clara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you had a copy of the 2021 local exceptions on your old laptop. I remember you showing them to me when we drafted the initial complaint." Clara stood at the edge of the table, her hands tucked into the pockets of her gray cardigan. "That was on my old hard drive, Julian," she said, her voice perfectly serene. "The one that caught that boot sector virus last winter. I had to wipe the entire disk to clean it, remember? You told me it was fine because everything was already backed up on the firm's main network." Julian's face went stiff. He did remember. He had told her that, because he hadn't wanted to pay the $200 fee to have a professional recovery service retrieve her personal files. He had dismissed her concern, saying, "It's just administrative clutter, Clara. Don't worry about it." Now, the memory seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his mind desperately searching for a way to turn the blame back onto her, but finding only his own past words blocking the path. But there must be another copy," Eleanor pleaded, looking back and forth between them. "Surely, Clara, you kept a paper copy. You're always so organized." "I only keep what Julian asks me to keep," Clara said, her tone devoid of any malice, a simple statement of fact that felt heavier than any accusation. "He's the lead counsel. He manages the records." She turned and walked back into the kitchen, her flat leather slippers making no sound on the hardwood floor. Behind her, the dining room was entirely silent. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 7 p.m. talk, talk, talk. Julian sat before his stack of printed, uncollated PDFs, his blunt pencil resting on the blank yellow pad. For the first time, he was looking not at a minor inconvenience or a technical glitch, but at the true, vast landscape of his own emptiness. The heavy brass iron gave a sudden, wet hiss, a cloud of hot, starchy steam billowing upward and momentarily dampening Clara's face. She adjusted her grip on the smooth wooden handle, sliding the metal plate across the thick, cream-colored damask tablecloth. This was her late-night physical routine. Every spring, ahead of the partners' dinner, the formal table linens had to be ironed while slightly damp to ensure the creases were razor-sharp. She moved the iron in long, rhythmic sweeps from the center to the edges, her left hand following behind, smoothing the hot fabric with her palms. The heat radiating off the metal warmed her fingers, which were still stiff from the cold afternoon in the butler's pantry. The house around her was dark, save for the single lamp in the laundry alcove and the faint, bluish glow of a computer screen radiating from the study down the hall. It was 11:42 p.m. From the study came the erratic, frantic clack, clack, clack of Julian's keyboard. He was typing in short, desperate bursts, followed by long silences, and then the sharp, rhythmic snap of the backspace key being held down for 10 seconds at a time. Occasionally, the old laser printer would groan to life, its internal rollers whirring and clunking as it spat out a single page, only for the sound of tearing paper to follow immediately after. Clara folded the damask tablecloth in half, matching the hemmed edges with absolute precision. She pressed the iron down along the new fold, the smell of clean linen and hot metal filling the small alcove. She picked up the stack of folded napkins and walked out of the alcove, her steps silent on the carpeted hallway. As she approached the linen closet near the stairs, she stopped. Sitting on the third step from the bottom, directly beneath the weak amber light of the landing chandelier, was a single sheet of printed paper. On it, a bright yellow sticky note was attached. Clara walked to the edge of the stairs. She looked down at the paper. In Julian's hurried, looping handwriting, the note read, "Clara, Section 4, Intro. Is the wording on the statutory intent right? Fix it, J." Indirect interaction. He had not come to her room. He had not asked her face to face. Even now, in the middle of his quiet panic, he was relying on the old, established channel of passive-aggressive demand. He had left the work on the stairs like a plate of dirty dishes, fully expecting her to pick it up, carry it to her desk, and return it to him before dawn, corrected and polished. Clara looked at the printed page. Through the yellow transparency of the sticky note, she could see his opening sentence. It was a rambling, emotional paragraph about judicial overreach and corporate maliciousness. He had misspelled precedent as precedent, and he had used the word clearly 3 times in the space of 4 lines. It was the writing of a desperate man trying to sound authoritative while drowning in a sea of half-remembered concepts. She stood on the stairs, the stack of warm, starchy linens pressed against her chest. Internal calculation. Her father's portrait hung on the landing wall directly above her, his painted eyes staring down with the stern, patrician authority that had defined the Vance household for 40 years. Julian was her father's chosen vessel. The firm was their father's monument. If she let Julian fail tomorrow morning, she was letting a piece of her father's legacy crumble. But she calculated the cost of that legacy. She calculated the years she had spent sitting in the basement of the courthouse, her fingers turning black from the carbon paper, while Julian was taken to lunch by the senior partners. She calculated the award ceremony, the white lilies, and her mother's hand pressing her down, telling her to smile and remain quiet. The legacy had never been her inheritance, it was only her cage. The energy required to pick up the paper, spend 3 hours rewriting the intro, and save the family name, 85%. The energy required to lift her left foot, clear the step, and walk back to her room, 5%. Clara adjusted the linens in her arms. She lifted her foot. She did not touch the paper. She did not even look at the yellow sticky note as she stepped over it, her long gray cardigan brushing against the edge of the page, causing it to flutter slightly on the wood before settling back into the dust. She opened the linen closet, placed the warm tablecloths on the second shelf next to the cedar blocks, and closed the door. The latch clicked shut with a small metallic snip. From the study down the hall, the typing had stopped. There was a long, heavy silence, and then the sound of Julian's chair scraping back. His footsteps approached the doorway of the study, stopping just inside the frame. Through the shadows of the hallway, Clara could see his outline, the slumped shoulders, the head tilted down as he looked at his phone, his face bathed in the cold, bluish light of the screen. He didn't call her name. He didn't ask if she was there. He stood in the doorway of his office like a ghost, staring into the dark corridor, as if waiting for some invisible force to solve the problem for him. Clara turned away. She walked down the hall to her own bedroom, opened her door, and stepped inside. She did not lock her door. She had never needed to. She simply closed it, the latch snapping into place, sealing her inside the quiet, cool dark of her own space, leaving Julian alone in the hall with his blunt pencil and his empty page. The grandfather clock downstairs struck midnight. Talk, talk, talk. The heavy, spring-loaded brass mail slot in the front door let out a sharp, metallic clack-clank, followed immediately by the soft, sliding rustle of envelopes hitting the marble floor of the foyer. Clara knelt on the cold stone. This was her morning routine. Every Thursday at 8:15 a.m., she sorted the physical mail into 3 precise piles on the bottom shelf of the mahogany console table. She used a long, thin silver letter opener with a handle carved like an ivy vine. Shk! The silver blade sliced through the thick, textured paper of the envelopes with a clean, whispery hiss, leaving a neat, straight edge. A cold, damp draft blew through the brass slot, carrying the smell of wet asphalt, morning fog, and the faint, bitter scent of decaying oak leaves from the driveway. She sorted the letters, a charity appeal for Eleanor from the Botanical Gardens, a thick, blue-bordered water bill, and 3 official notices from the State Bar Association addressed to Julian. As she was placing the last notice onto Julian's pile, a shadow fell across the floor. Julian descended the stairs. He was wearing his dark blue litigation suit, but his collar was unbuttoned, and his silk tie hung loosely around his neck like a deflated noose. He had not shaved. The dark stubble on his jaw made him look older, his face hollowed out by 36 hours of sleepless panic. His hair, usually styled back with meticulous care, looked flat and greasy. On the 3rd step from the bottom, the single sheet of paper he had left the night before still lay exactly where Clara had stepped over it. It was slightly crumpled now, bearing the dusty, faint oval print of Eleanor's house slipper from earlier that morning. Julian stopped. He stared down at the paper. Indirect interaction. He did not speak to Clara. He did not ask her why she had ignored his note. Instead, he bent down slowly, his joints stiff, and snatched the page off the wood with a sharp, snapping motion that tore the yellow sticky note in half. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles turning white before shoving it deep into his trousers pocket. He stepped off the stairs, his leather-soled shoes making a heavy, flat sound on the marble. He grabbed his briefcase from the console table, nearly knocking over Clara's neat piles of mail in the process. "I hope you're pleased with yourself," Julian said. His voice was no longer loud or performative. It was a low, hoarse whisper vibrating with a quiet, venomous exhaustion. He stood by the door, his hand resting on the heavy brass handle, but he did not look at her. He looked at his own reflection in the narrow glass window beside the frame. "If Miller gets the Vance lead today, it's not just my reputation, it's the firm's, its father's name." Clara did not stop her work. She picked up the silver letter opener, slid it beneath the flap of the water bill, and sliced it open. "Shh. The firm is built on the law, Julian," she said softly, her voice cool and steady against the draft from the door. "Not just the name." Julian let out a short, bitter sound that was half laugh, half cough. He didn't answer. He pulled the heavy oak door open, the damp morning fog rolling into the warm foyer in a slow gray wave, and stepped out. The door slammed shut behind him with a dull, rattling thud that made the crystal drops of the chandelier overhead chime in a faint, glass-on-glass murmur. Clara sat on her knees for a moment, listening to the distant, rising roar of his car engine as he backed down the gravel driveway. Eleanor descended the stairs a minute later, holding a cold, untouched cup of tea. Her silk kimono was tied loosely, and her face looked pale, the fine lines around her mouth deeper than they had been on Monday night. She stopped on the landing, looking at the empty spot on the third step where the paper had been, and then at Clara. "He didn't even sleep, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly with a quiet, maternal despair. "He was on the floor of his study at 4 a.m, trying to read those old books with a magnifying glass. He looked so small. Why are you doing this? What is it you want?" Internal calculation. Eleanor was appealing to her guilt, trying to frame Clara's quiet withdrawal as an active, cruel assault on her brother. If Clara defended herself, if she pointed out that Julian had stolen her work, dismissed her intelligence, and called her his typing assistant in front of the entire county bar, Eleanor would simply dismiss it as the natural order of things. She would say, "But that's just how the world works, Clara. Julian is the face of the family. Surely you can see that." The energy required to demand her mother's validation, 95%. The energy required to let her mother's confusion fester, 0%. Clara stood up. She smoothed the front of her gray cardigan, her fingers catching on the rough wool. "I'm just sorting the mail, Mother," Clara said, her tone perfectly polite and empty of warmth. "The utility bills are rising. We should look at the budget next week." She turned and walked down the hallway toward the library, leaving her mother standing on the stairs in the dim, cold light of the foyer. Inside the library, Clara sat at her small secretary desk. She opened her laptop. The Cold War was over, the boundaries had been drawn, and the family had felt the first, terrifying freeze of her absence. Now, the silent preparation began. She did not log back into Julian's profile. Instead, she opened her own local, offline archives. She accessed the draft of the final joint appendix for the Vance versus Sterling appeal, the massive 300-page procedural document that had to be submitted to the appellate court clerk next Tuesday. This was the document that officially bound both parties to the record. Once filed, it could not be amended. Clara scrolled down to page 84, the schedule of service and filing dates. She looked at the date of the lower court's final order. It was recorded as October 14th. If the appeal was filed on Tuesday, it would be exactly on the 90-day deadline. Clara placed her cursor at the end of the date. With 2 quiet strokes of her keyboard, She deleted the number 4 and replaced it with a 5. October 15th. It was a tiny, unnoticeable difference, a single digit. To Julian, who never verified dates, it would look like a minor typo, if he noticed it at all. But to the appellate clerk, who used automated software to verify jurisdictional deadlines, the change would make the filing appear to have been submitted 91 days after the order, 1 day past the absolute, non-extendable statutory limit. Under Appellate Rule 4A, a late filing was a jurisdictional defect. It meant the court had no power to hear the case. The appeal would be dismissed automatically with prejudice. Clara stared at the screen, her face bathed in the pale blue glow of the monitor. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 8:30 a.m. Talk, talk, talk. She saved the file to her local drive. She did not upload it. She would wait. She would let Julian sweat through his 48-hour deadline with Arthur. She would let him think he had survived the first hairline fracture before she handed him the document that would shatter his world in open court. The lead crystal decanter was remarkably heavy, its deep, diamond-cut facets catching the gray afternoon light and fracturing it into tiny, dull rainbows across the pantry counter. Clara tilted the bottle, pouring in a half cup of raw, white rice grains through a silver funnel, followed by a warm splash of white vinegar. She removed the funnel, sealed the mouth with her thumb, and began to swirl the container in steady, circular motions. Inside, the hard grains of rice rattled against the internal corners of the glass with a sharp, dry clack, 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 scrubbing away the stubborn, cloudy white sediment left behind by years of vintage port. This was her afternoon routine. Every Thursday at 3:30 p.m., she cleaned the barware in the dining room sideboard, the decanters, the crystal tumblers, the heavy silver ice bucket. All of it had to be free of dust and residue, ready for the weekend when guests might arrive. Though lately, the house had remained entirely quiet. The sharp, clean sting of warm vinegar filled her nostrils, a medicinal scent that cut through the stale, sweet odor of the old alcohol. The front doorbell rang, its long, chime-like tones echoing through the empty halls. Clara did not move to answer it. She kept her thumb pressed firmly over the decanter's mouth, her arm moving in the same smooth, hypnotic rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. She heard Eleanor's hurried footsteps in the foyer, the soft murmur of a brief conversation with a courier, and then the sound of a heavy cardboard envelope tearing open. A moment later, Eleanor appeared at the pantry door. She was holding a stack of official-looking documents printed on thick, cream-colored bond paper bearing the embossed gold seal of Vance and Associates Trust Management. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice thin and strained. She held the papers out, her fingers hovering near the bottom of the page where a small yellow signature flag had been attached. "This just arrived from the bank. It's the quarterly discretionary release for the house maintenance and the office lease. Mr. Sterling's office says they can't process the transfer because your signature is missing on the joint authorization." Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes scanning Clara's face with a look of desperate, polite confusion. "I'm sure it was just an oversight. You're usually so meticulous about the trust documents. If you could just sign it now, I can have the courier take it back to the branch before they close at 5. Indirect interaction. Eleanor was presenting the document as a simple mechanical chore, a tiny detail Clara had forgotten, rather than acknowledging that the discretionary release was the only thing keeping the family's joint accounts funded. She was attempting to use the courier's presence to force Clara's compliance without having to discuss the actual power Clara held over their finances. Clara stopped swirling the decanter, She set it down on the marble counter, the wet rice settling to the bottom in a dense white layer. She took a clean linen cloth and slowly began to wipe the vinegar from her thumb. Internal calculation. The Vance family trust had been established by their father 20 years ago, while Julian had been given the prestigious title of senior partner at the law firm. Their father, fully aware of Julian's reckless personal spending and Clara's cold, analytical precision, had made Clara the sole administrative trustee. Julian and Eleanor were beneficiaries, but no discretionary funds could be withdrawn from the main capital without Clara's explicit, co-signed authorization. Normally, Clara signed the quarterly releases 3 weeks in advance, ensuring the mortgage on the estate and the lease on Julian's high-rise office suite were paid seamlessly from the trust's interest. This quarter, she had simply left the documents sitting in her desk drawer. If she signed the authorization now, the bank would release $45,000 by tomorrow morning. Julian's credit lines would remain secure, and the mortgage would be paid. If she did not sign, the trust accounts would freeze discretionary payouts for the next 30 days. To cover the office lease and the estate's property taxes due on Monday, Julian would have to deplete his personal savings, or explain to the firm's accounting department why his family trust was suddenly unavailable. The energy required to sign the paper and maintain the financial illusion, 100%. The energy required to let the bureaucratic gears of the trust lock up, 0%. Clara did not reach for the pen Eleanor was holding out to her. "I can't sign that today, Mother," Clara said, her voice quiet and entirely empty of apology. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly, the paper rustling in her grip. "What do you mean you can't sign it? Clara, the mortgage is due on Monday, and Julian's office lease, if the transfer doesn't go through, the firm's finance committee will flag his account. You know how strict they are about overhead." "There are some discrepancies in the trust's ledger from the last quarter," Clara said, her eyes calm and unblinking as she looked at her mother. "Several personal charges from Julian's trip to the Bahamas were billed under professional development. I have to audit the receipts before I can legally sign the compliance certification." "Audit the receipts?" Eleanor's voice rose, a high, panicked note breaking through her polite exterior. "Clara, he's your brother. He just won a major award. He had to entertain clients in the Bahamas. Surely you don't expect him to pay for those things out of his own pocket." "The trust guidelines are very clear, Mother," Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly even. "I am personally liable if the tax authorities audit the distributions. I won't sign a false certification." "But the courier is waiting." Eleanor took another step forward, her face turning a pale, blotchy red. "Can't you just sign it now and audit the receipts next week? Julian is already under so much stress. If he finds out the lease payment is delayed—" "The courier will have to leave," Clara interrupted gently. She picked up the decanter, filled it with hot water, and watched the rice grains swirl and dance in the sudden steaming turbulence. "I will contact the trust officer on Tuesday morning. I'm sure we can resolve the discrepancies then." Eleanor stared at her, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the words to break through Clara's quiet, icy wall of logic. But there was nothing to fight. Clara was not shouting. She was not demanding an apology. She was simply enforcing the very rules their father had written. Slowly, Eleanor's hand dropped to her side. The cream-colored papers crumpled slightly in her grip. She turned without a word, her steps heavy and hesitant as she walked back to the foyer to dismiss the courier. Clara poured the water and the rice out of the decanter, watching the grains slide down the brass drain in a steady white stream. The glass was perfectly clean now, brilliant and empty, ready to be filled with whatever she chose. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 4 p.m. Tock, tock, tock. The golden honey fell from the grooved wooden dipper in a slow, heavy, twisting thread. It settled at the bottom of the porcelain cup in a dense, silent pool, refusing to mix with the hot water until Clara began to stir it with her silver spoon. This was her evening routine. Every night at 8:30 p.m., she prepared Eleanor's chamomile tea. The water had to be boiled in the small copper saucepan, never the microwave, and poured over exactly 2 teaspoons of dried German chamomile flowers in the earthenware pot. It had to steep for precisely 5 minutes, no more, no less, to prevent the herbs from turning bitter. The kitchen was entirely dark, save for the low blue hiss of the gas burner beneath the copper pan. The earthy, apple-like fragrance of the chamomile rose with the steam, a soothing, medicinal scent that seemed to belong to a much older, quieter house. Clara placed the cup, a small linen napkin, and the silver spoon on a small lacquer tray. She picked it up, her thumbs balancing the weight against her hips, and walked out into the dark hallway. As she reached the landing of the second floor, she stopped. The door to Julian's bedroom was open a few inches, a warm bar of light cutting across the dark carpet of the corridor. From inside came the low, urgent murmur of voices. Clara did not step into the light. She stood in the shadow of the linen closet, the lacquer tray resting steadily in her hands. "I can't ask Arthur for an advance." Julian's voice was a harsh, defensive whisper. He was pacing the floor of his bedroom, his leather shoes gone, his stockinged feet making a dull sliding sound on the Persian rug. "If I go to the finance committee and ask for a draw on my quarterly distribution to cover the lease, they'll know something is wrong. They'll look at my billable hours. They'll see that 3 of my major files are completely stalled because the research isn't done." "But darling, surely a small personal loan from the estate's capital." Eleanor's voice was frantic, hushed, and pleading. "The trust capital is locked, Mom," Julian snapped, though he kept his voice low. "The bank's compliance officer called me back this afternoon. He said until the trustee signs the audit certification, they cannot release any discretionary funds. He actually asked me if I had my sister's authorization. My sister's. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" "I'll talk to her again," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked any real conviction. She's being stubborn about those Bahamas receipts. You know how she's always been about the small details. She's probably just tired." "She's doing it on purpose," Julian muttered, his pace slowing. "She knows exactly what she's doing. She's trying to punish me because of what I said at the banquet. She's always been jealous, Mom. Ever since Father left the administrative trust to her. She couldn't cut it at the firm, so she's sitting in the dark, pulling the strings." Indirect interaction. Julian was refusing to confront Clara directly. He was too proud to walk down the hall, look her in the eyes, and ask her to release the funds. Instead, he was hiding behind Eleanor, using their mother as a shield and a messenger, hoping that the weight of maternal authority would eventually break Clara's resolve. Clara looked down at the chamomile tea on her tray. A thin, delicate skin of condensation had formed on the inside of the porcelain cup. Internal calculation. Julian had exactly $12,400 in his personal checking account. Clara knew this because she had been the one to set up his automated online banking 5 years ago to keep him from missing his car payments. The monthly lease on his private office suite at Pendleton and Vance was $9,600. The estate's property taxes, which Julian was legally obligated to pay under the terms of their father's will, were $15,800, due this coming Monday. If Clara signed the trust release tonight, the accounts would clear, the payments would be made, and Julian's professional veneer would remain untouched. If she did not sign, the lease would default, his credit lines would freeze, and the estate's property taxes would go into immediate delinquency, triggering an automated notice to the firm's senior partners, who viewed financial instability as a major character flaw. The energy required to surrender, sign the paper, and keep his world turning, 100%. The energy required to walk past his door and leave the tea, 0%. Clara adjusted the tray in her hands. She did not look at the sliver of light from Julian's room as she walked past. Her steps on the carpeted runner were entirely silent, a ghost moving through the dark corridor. She walked to the end of the hall, placed the lacquer tray on the small mahogany table outside Eleanor's bedroom door, and turned back toward her own room. Once inside, she did not turn on the light. She walked over to her closet and opened the doors. On the floor of the closet sat a large, old-fashioned leather trunk with brass latches, the one her father had used during his university days. Slowly, with quiet, deliberate movements, Clara began to pack. She did not pack her clothes; those could be replaced. Instead, she reached into the back of her desk drawer and pulled out her personal archives. She packed her law degree from the State University, the one she had earned through 4 years of grueling night classes while working 40 hours a week to pay for Julian's Ivy League tuition. She packed her physical research journals, filled with her own neat, handwritten case annotations from the past 10 years. She packed her father's private letters, the ones where he had confessed his doubts about Julian's legal acumen. Finally, she pulled her personal laptop from her desk. She opened the administrative console for her private cloud storage, the one containing the backup files for every major case Julian had handled over the last 5 years. She selected the directory labeled Vance_V_Sterling_backups. She clicked Encrypt Directory. She entered a new, random 16-digit passphrase that she had not written down anywhere. The progress bar on her screen began to crawl, a tiny, glowing blue line that steadily locked away the only copy of the research Julian needed to survive the upcoming appeal. Clara closed her laptop and placed it in the trunk. She let the heavy leather lid drop, the brass latches clicking into place with a definitive, metallic clank. The grandfather clock downstairs struck 9 p.m. Talk, talk, talk. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, the faint, sweet smell of chamomile still clinging to her fingers, listening to the quiet, desperate pacing of her brother's feet down the hall. The brass shears made a clean, metallic shring clink as the blades met. Clara held a dry, brittle leaf of the large fiddle-leaf fig between her fingers, pressing the cold metal against the woody stem. Snip! The withered, papery leaf severed instantly, dropping to the red terracotta tiles of the sunroom floor with a light, hollow rattle. This was her Friday morning routine. Every Friday at 9:30 a.m., she tended to the plants in the sunroom. The glass-enclosed space was cold, the morning fog pressing flat against the outer panes, turning the view of the lawn into a blurred gray wash. She moved from pot to pot with a small brass watering can, checking the soil with the tip of her index finger, clipping away the dead growth, and wiping the broad, dark green leaves with a damp sponge to remove the thin layer of dust that had settled over the week. The faint, earthy smell of wet peat and moss rose from the pots, a heavy, damp scent that felt entirely isolated from the rest of the silent, drafty house. The telephone on the sunroom wall let out a sharp, double ring. It was the private line, the one reserved for the firm and close family associates. Clara set the watering can down on a wicker table. She wiped her hands on her linen apron, reached for the receiver, and pressed it to her ear. "Vance residence," she said. "Clara, it's Arthur Pendleton." The senior partner's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, sounding incredibly tired. In the background, Clara could hear the distant, rhythmic hum of the office ventilation system and the faint click of a typewriter. Arthur was a traditionalist. He still kept an old IBM Selectric in his office for typing personal notes. "Good morning, Mr. Pendleton," Clara said. her voice smooth and perfectly level. "I'm calling because I can't reach Julian on his mobile," Arthur said, a dry, impatient edge to his words. "He submitted his revised Section 4 draft late last night. I reviewed it this morning. It was adequate, Clara. The citations are correct this time, though the prose lacks the sharp, surgical focus I usually see in his work. But it will pass." He paused, the sound of paper rustling over the line. "What concerns me now is the joint appendix. The filing deadline is Tuesday at noon. This is a massive document, Clara. If there is a single page missing, or if the index doesn't match the lower court record exactly, the clerk's office will reject the entire appeal. Has Julian prepared the final schedule of service?" Indirect interaction. Arthur was calling her because he knew, without ever having to state it openly, that Julian was incapable of managing a complex procedural filing on his own. He was bypassing Julian entirely, treating Clara as the de facto managing clerk of the case, hoping she would quietly assure him that the structural integrity of the appeal was secure. Clara looked down at the pile of dry brown leaves on the terracotta tiles. Internal calculation. Julian's revised Section 4 had indeed been adequate because he had spent the entire night copying paragraphs from an old appellate brief she had written 3 years ago for a different client, changing only the names and dates. It was plagiarized from her own past labor, but it was legally safe. However, the joint appendix was different. Clara had already modified page 84 of the draft, changing the lower court's order date to October 15th, the single-digit error that would make the entire appeal jurisdictionally late and trigger an automatic dismissal. If she told Arthur now that she had the draft on her computer, Arthur would ask her to email it to his secretary immediately for verification. His secretary, a meticulous woman who had been with the firm for 20 years, would run the automated compliance check and spot the date mismatch in seconds. Julian would be saved, the error corrected, and the appeal would proceed. But if she let Julian deliver the file himself on Monday, his pride would prevent him from asking anyone to double-check it. He would present it to the court clerk as his own masterpiece, signed under his own name. The energy required to blow the whistle, correct the file, and protect him, 95%. The energy required to let him claim full ownership of his destruction, 0%. Julian wanted to handle the final assembly of the joint appendix himself this time, Mr. Pendleton, Clara said, her voice calm, polite, and entirely empty of hesitation. He was very clear that he wanted to manage the procedural details personally to ensure they align with his strategy for the oral argument. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Clara could hear Arthur's slow, deliberate breathing. He knew Julian. He knew Julian's vanity. The explanation made perfect sense to him. It was exactly the kind of arrogant, protective gesture Julian would make after being humiliated on Wednesday. "I see," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a lower, slightly skeptical register. "Well, if he insists on holding the reins, so be it. But remind him, Clara, the litigation committee is watching this filing very closely. If there is any delay or any procedural defect, I won't be able to shield him from the other partners. He signed his name to this case. He carries the risk." "I understand, Mr. Pendleton," Clara said. "I will make sure he knows you called." "Thank you, Clara," Arthur sighed. "Have a good weekend." The line clicked and went dead. Clara hung up the receiver. She stood in the quiet sunroom, the cold gray light resting on her shoulders. By telling Arthur that Julian was handling the appendix personally, she had not just protected her secret, she had laid the final, perfect brick in the wall of his isolation. When the appeal was dismissed next week, Julian would not be able to blame a clerical error, a technical glitch, or his little assistant. He had claimed the work. He had signed the document. The record would show that the failure belonged entirely to him. Clara? Eleanor was standing at the entrance of the sunroom, her fingers nervously clutching the lapels of her knit cardigan. She looked pale, her eyes dark with a restless, hovering anxiety. "Was that the office?" Eleanor asked, her voice hushed. "Was that Arthur?" "Yes, Mother," Clara said, picking up her brass shears again. "What did he say?" Eleanor took a step closer, her gaze darting to the dry leaves on the floor. "Is Julian going to keep the case? Did they accept his draft?" "Mr. Pendleton said the draft was adequate," Clara said. She reached up, snipping another dry stem from the fiddle-leaf fig. Snip. "He was just checking on the joint appendix. I told him Julian is handling it personally." Eleanor let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief, her shoulders sagging. "Oh, thank God. I knew he would find a way. He's just so resilient, Clara. He always finds a path through." Clara did not answer. She wiped the broad green leaf of the plant with her damp sponge, watching the gray dust disappear, leaving the surface dark, glossy, and cold. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10 a.m. Talk, talk, talk. The wool rag was warm under Clara's palm. She pressed her weight down, moving her hand in long, slow, overlapping circles across the expansive surface of the mahogany dining table. This was her Saturday morning routine. Every Saturday at 9 a.m., she polished the grand table. The wood was a single massive slab of Honduran mahogany that her great-grandfather had imported in the 20s. It required a custom mixture of raw linseed oil, beeswax, and a few drops of lemon essence. The oil had to be worked deep into the dry pores of the wood, heated by the friction of her hand, until the pale, dusty grain darkened into a rich, deep hue, the color of dried molasses. The sweet, heavy scent of beeswax and warm oil filled the dining room, a suffocatingly rich fragrance that seemed to coat the back of Clara's throat. As she worked, her own reflection followed her hand through the wood, a dark, distorted shadow gliding across the liquid surface of the polish, silent and gray. The soft, frantic padding of house slippers on the rug signaled Eleanor's approach. She didn't enter the room with her usual slow, patrician grace. She stopped at the edge of the dining room, her fingers gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles were a bloodless paper white. "Clara," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of a sudden, sharp panic. "Julian just called. He went down to the firm's private garage this morning to park, and his corporate card was declined. The attendant wouldn't let him in without cash. He had to park 3 blocks away in the public lot, in the rain." She took a step closer to the table, her eyes wide, staring at the dark circles Clara's rag was making in the wood. "And then he tried to transfer the lease payment for his office suite online from his personal account to bypass the trust delay. But the system rejected it. The bank has flagged his account. They've locked his personal debit card, Clara. He tried to run it 3 times at the branch ATM, and the machine kept his card." Indirect interaction. Eleanor was presenting Julian's public embarrassment as a tragedy, a series of malicious errors inflicted upon him by the universe, rather than the predictable outcome of his own basic financial neglect. She stood at the edge of the polished mahogany, expecting Clara to drop the rag, apologize for the mistake, and immediately fix the accounts. Clara did not stop polishing. She shifted her weight, starting on a new circle near the center of the table, her palm feeling the steady, warm resistance of the wood. Internal calculation. Julian had exactly $12,400 in his personal account. His monthly lease was $9,600. He had forgotten, as he did every month, that his automatic lease purchase payment for the European sports car, $3,200, cleared on the first Friday of every month. The car payment had gone through yesterday afternoon. It had left him with exactly $9,200 in his account, $400 short of his lease. When the transaction was declined, Julian's immediate reaction, born of panic and entitlement, would have been to try the card repeatedly, assuming the bank's system was at fault. The automated fraud detection had simply done its job, locking his profile and swallowing the plastic. Even if Clara signed the trust release right this second, the bank's private wealth department was closed for the weekend. No manual overrides would be processed until Tuesday morning. The mortgage on the estate would go into default on Monday night, and Julian's lease would be flagged as delinquent by the firm's management committee at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, exactly 3 hours before his appeal deadline. The energy required to explain the basic arithmetic of his checking account to Eleanor, 90%. The energy required to let them stew in the silence of their own financial ignorance, 0%. The bank's trust department is closed on Saturdays, Mother, Clara said softly, her hand continuing its slow, rhythmic circles. Shh, shh, shh. Even if I signed the authorization now, the compliance officer won't be at his desk until Tuesday morning. They don't process discretionary transfers over the weekend. But Monday is the mortgage! Eleanor's voice rose, a sharp, unvarnished screech that seemed to rattle the crystal drops of the wall sconces. And Julian's office lease! Clara, if the firm's finance committee sees that his lease payment has failed, they'll put a hold on his share of the quarterly distributions. He won't have any income for the next 3 months. Then I suppose Julian will have to call the branch manager on Monday morning, Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly serene, a cool draft of wind against Eleanor's rising heat. I'm sure he can explain the situation. He has such an excellent relationship with the community. You aren't going to do anything? Eleanor took a step toward the table, her face twisting into a look of genuine, terrified bewilderment. She looked at the polished mahogany, then at Clara's calm, unblinking eyes. Clara, this is our home. This is your brother's career. You're talking about them as if they belong to strangers. Clara stopped polishing. She set the wool rag down on the dark, glossy wood. She looked at her mother, her expression empty of anger, empty of resentment, empty of any recognizable feeling at all. The rules of the trust are designed to protect the capital, Mother, Clara said, her voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Father wrote them that way because he knew what would happen if the accounts weren't managed with precision. I'm simply following his instructions. Eleanor stared at her, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked at the mahogany table, polished so bright it looked like a dark, bottomless pool of oil in the center of the room. She looked at her own face reflected in the wood, pale, lined, and suddenly very old. She turned and walked out of the room, her slippers dragging on the carpet as she went to the library to make another frantic, useless phone call to her brother. Clara picked up the wool rag. She began to buff the wood again, her hand moving in the same slow, hypnotic circles, erasing the dull smudges of her mother's shadow from the perfect, liquid shine of the mahogany. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 9:30 a.m. Talk, talk, talk. The small round tin of black shoe polish opened with a sharp metallic pop. Clara sat on the low wooden bench in the mudroom, the cold draft from the heavy service door seeping through the thin soles of her leather slippers. The air in the narrow room was instantly flooded with the sharp, chemical scent of pine turpentine and rich carnauba wax. This was her Sunday morning routine. Every Sunday at 7:15 a.m., she shined Julian's court shoes. She took the wooden cedar shoe tree, compressing the spring with the heel of her hand, and slid it into the left oxford. The leather pulled taut, the cedar absorbing the faint, stale moisture of the week's wear, leaving the surface tight and ready for the wax. She wrapped a soft strip of white cotton tightly around her index and middle fingers, dipped the tip into the solid black polish, and began to work it into the toe cap. She moved her fingers in tight, fast circles. The friction generated a faint heat beneath the cotton, melting the wax, forcing it deep into the microscopic pores and tiny creases of the Italian calfskin. The house was entirely silent. Sunday was a dead zone. The banks were closed. The firm's offices were locked. The invisible, crushing weight of the frozen trust account and the looming mortgage default hung in the air. But because it could not be acted upon, it was simply ignored. The heavy, dragging slide of house slippers sounded on the hardwood of the adjoining kitchen. Julian appeared in the doorway of the mudroom. He was wearing his heavy silk dressing gown tied loosely around his waist. He had finally shaved, but the razor had been careless. A small, angry red nick sat on his jawline, and the skin around his eyes was pale and sunken. He held a mug of hot water with lemon, not coffee. His stomach, it seemed, could no longer handle the acid. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes dropping to the black oxford in Clara's hands. "Are those the captos?" Julian asked. His voice was thin, but he forced a tone of casual, authoritative command, desperately trying to construct a sense of normalcy. "Yes," Clara said softly, her fingers continuing their rapid circular motion. "Good." Julian took a slow sip of his hot water, his hand trembling so slightly that the liquid barely quivered in the mug. "I'm wearing the charcoal suit on Tuesday. I want the mirror shine on the toes. Use the velvet cloth for the final buff, Clara. The horsehair brush always leaves those microscopic streaks, and Arthur notices these things." Indirect interaction. He was standing 24 hours away from a catastrophic financial default. His personal bank account was locked, his credit cards were swallowed, and his office lease was unpaid. Yet, he could not bring himself to mention the money to Clara. His pride forbade it. Instead, he projected his entire need for control onto the gloss of his shoes, treating her as his valet, pretending that a flawless physical presentation on Tuesday would magically bridge the abyss of Monday. Clara dipped her cotton-wrapped fingers back into the tin, picking up another fraction of an ounce of wax. Internal calculation. Julian believed that the final mile of his legal victory was purely aesthetic. He thought that if he walked into the appellate clerk's office wearing a bespoke suit and mirror-polished shoes, handing over the thick, bound stack of the joint appendix, the sheer force of his pedigree would carry him through. If Clara stopped polishing, looked up at him, and pointed out that a mirror shine would not stop the court's automated calendar system from rejecting a late filing, his fragile illusion would shatter. He would demand to see the files. He would drag her to the library, force her to open her computer, and make her double-check every single date. The energy required to break his illusion and save him from his own vanity, 95%. The energy required to give him exactly what he asked for, 0%. "I will use the velvet cloth, Julian," Clara said, her voice a soothing, empty current of air. "The mirror shine will be perfect." Julian exhaled a long, shaky breath, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. He nodded once, accepting her compliance as his due. "I'm delivering the Vance appendix to the clerk personally at 9 o'clock on Tuesday. I want the litigation committee to see that I manage my own filings from start to finish. I don't need a paralegal holding my hand." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked back into the kitchen, the soft slide of his slippers fading into the vast, drafty silence of the estate. Clara picked up the large horsehair brush. Swish, swish, swish. She ran the stiff bristles over the sides of the shoe, clearing the excess wax before picking up the square of black velvet. She breathed a tiny puff of condensation onto the toe cap and buffed it with the velvet until the leather transformed into a dark, liquid glass. In the deep black surface, she could see the distorted reflection of the mudroom window and the gray morning light beyond it. She finished the second shoe. She removed the wooden cedar trees, the springs releasing with a sharp thwack, and set the Oxfords on the floor. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She picked up the shoes, carrying them carefully by the heels so as not to smudge the gloss, and walked out of the mudroom, through the kitchen, and into the grand foyer. She placed the shoes precisely in the center of the Persian runner, perfectly aligned, pointing toward the heavy oak front door. Then, Clara reached into the deep pocket of her gray wool cardigan. Her fingers closed around a small, cold object. She pulled it out. It was a silver USB flash drive, no larger than a house key. On this drive was the final, formatted PDF of the Vance versus Sterling joint appendix. It contained 300 pages of immaculate, flawless legal research, beautiful formatting, and perfectly cited precedent. And on page 84, the date of the lower court's order was quietly typed as October 15th instead of October 14th. It was the poisoned apple. And Julian had just declared to Arthur Pendleton, and to Clara herself, that he was going to take a massive bite out of it in front of the entire appellate clerk's office. Clara stepped up to the mahogany console table. She bypassed the neat stacks of Thursday's sorted mail, which still sat exactly where she had left them. She looked at the silver tray where Julian always dropped his belongings. His heavy brass keyring lay in the center of the silver dish. With absolute, terrifying gentleness, Clara placed the silver USB drive directly on top of the keyring. The two metals clinked together with a tiny, crystalline chime that echoed briefly in the cavernous foyer before fading into nothing. She did not leave a yellow sticky note. She did not leave a set of instructions. She simply left the weapon exactly where his hand would fall when he rushed out the door on Tuesday morning. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8 a.m. Tock, tock, tock. Clara turned away from the console table. She walked silently back toward the library, the Sunday morning shadows stretching long and sharp across the marble floor, leaving the foyer waiting for the dawn of Monday. The cold water from the copper tap ran over Clara's hands in a steady, icy stream. She pressed a thick bar of harsh laundry soap against the French cuff of Julian's white cotton dress shirt, the lye-scented suds rising in a thin, pale lather that smelled of bleach and old tallow. This was her Monday morning routine. Every Monday at 8:30 a.m., she hand-washed Julian's court shirts in the stone laundry basin in the cellar. Julian's skin was sensitive to the industrial detergents used by the professional dry cleaners, so Clara prepared them herself. She used a stiff, bristled brush to scrub the inside of the collar and the cuffs where grease and ink from his files always left a gray, oily smudge. The water was so cold it turned her knuckles a raw, burning red, the skin of her fingers tightening until her movements felt clumsy and stiff. The heavy metallic bring of the landline telephone in the hallway upstairs cut through the wet slosh of her hands in the basin. It had rung 4 times already since 8 o'clock, each call ending with a brief, tense silence before the automated system dialed again. A moment later, Eleanor's hurried, clattering steps sounded on the wooden cellar stairs. She did not stop on the landing. She came all the way down into the dim, damp room, her emerald silk kimono dragging through the gray dust of the concrete floor. She carried her iPad in one hand, her face completely pale, her eyes wide with an unvarnished, sharp terror. "Clara!" Eleanor gasped, her voice raw and breathless. "The mortgage company. They've just called again. They say the trust transfer was officially rejected at 9 o'clock. The payment was due today. They've already flagged the account as delinquent, Clara. They've sent an automated notification to Julian's firm email. His business address is listed on the deed." She stepped close to the stone basin, the cold, soapy water splashing against her silk sleeve, but she didn't seem to notice. "Julian's private office has already received an alert from the firm's finance director. Arthur's secretary called me 5 minutes ago. She asked if there was a clerical error with the estate. Clara, you have to sign the release now. The bank says they can process a priority wire if the trustee authorizes it manually. You have to do it." Indirect interaction. Eleanor was still pretending that Clara's refusal was a minor, stubborn misunderstanding, a clerical delay that could be bypassed with a sudden, emotional appeal. She was trying to override Clara's silence with the sheer volume of her panic, treating the cellar as a temporary courtroom where she could demand immediate compliance. Clara did not stop scrubbing. She pressed the stiff bristles of the brush against the white cotton, the harsh scritch-scratch sound filling the damp cellar. Internal calculation. The automated notification from the mortgage company was programmed to trigger at 9:01 a.m. on the first day of delinquency. Because the Vance estate was held under a joint corporate partnership to dodge the local inheritance taxes, the default alert went directly to the firm's compliance committee. If Clara signed the manual override now, the priority wire would clear by noon. Julian's credit rating would be restored, the firm's finance director would cancel the alert, and Julian would walk into court tomorrow morning with his financial slate completely clean. If she did not sign, the delinquency would remain on the firm's record for 30 days. Julian would be stripped of his partnership draw for the quarter to cover the estate's liability, and the firm's litigation committee would put a formal freeze on his promotional budget. The energy required to capitulate and restore his safety net, 100%. The energy required to continue scrubbing the cuff under the freezing water, 0%. "The bank's manual overrides require 24 hours to process, Mother," Clara said, her voice quiet, steady, and entirely empty of feeling. "I told you on Saturday. The compliance officer is out. I cannot sign a certification for receipts I haven't audited." "Audited?" Eleanor's voice suddenly broke. The polite, genteel mask of the academic mother, the woman who spent 40 years hosting passive-aggressive charity teas and speaking in melodic, condescending whispers, shattered completely. Her face twisted into a dark, ugly mask of pure, vicious rage. She slapped her iPad down on the wooden washing table, the plastic cracking against the edge of the wood. "You selfish, parasitic little girl," Eleanor screamed, her voice echoing off the damp concrete walls of the cellar like a physical blow. "Your father only left you the administrative trust because he knew you were too weak and incompetent to survive on your own. He knew you didn't have your brother's brilliance or his light. He left you to manage the money because he wanted to give his typing assistant a safe little corner where she wouldn't starve." She leaned over the stone basin, her breath hot and smelling of stale coffee against Clara's cheek. "You've sat in this house for 10 years, living off your brother's success. And now you're trying to ruin him because you are jealous. You are a spiteful, small-minded typist, Clara. If you don't sign that paper, I will have Julian file a petition to have you removed as trustee for mental incompetence. We will drag you through the probate court, and we will leave you with nothing." Clara did not flinch. She did not raise her eyes from the white cotton shirt in her hands. Her mind, cool and detached, recorded the words. They were not an injury, they were a confirmation. The polite language of support and family duty was gone, replaced by the raw, unvarnished truth of how they had always seen her. An appliance, a resource to be used, and a parasite the moment she refused to be drained. She felt a strange, absolute lightness in her chest. The final line had been crossed. The targets had revealed their true faces, and in doing so, they had freed her from the last, lingering shadow of familial obligation. The energy required to argue, to defend her intelligence, or to cry. 0%. The energy required to lift the wet shirt from the water. 5%. Clara turned off the copper tap. The sudden silence in the cellar was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the water from the spout. She lifted Julian's shirt from the basin. The water ran out of the fabric in long, clean streams, splashing against her red, numb knuckles. "The shirt is clean, Mother," Clara said softly, her voice perfectly calm, as cold as the well water in the stone tub. "I will hang it in the laundry alcove to dry. Julian will need it for court tomorrow." Eleanor stared at her, her chest heaving under her silk kimono, her mouth open as if she wanted to scream more, to find some word, some insult that would finally make Clara break. But as she looked at Clara's quiet, empty eyes, she realized she had used her heaviest weapon, and it had passed through her daughter like a stone through water. With a sharp, frustrated gasp, Eleanor grabbed her iPad, turned, and rushed up the cellar stairs, her slippers slapping violently against the wood until she slammed the cellar door shut, leaving Clara alone in the dim, damp quiet. Clara placed the wet shirt on a smooth wooden hanger. She carefully smoothed out the collar, ensuring the sharp, clean lines were perfect, ready for the morning. The grandfather clock upstairs struck 9:30 a.m. Talk, talk, talk. The white, acid-free tissue paper made a dry, whispery rustle as Clara laid it flat across the polished cherry wood of her desk. She picked up the first of her black, leather-bound research journals, its spine worn and soft from a decade of touch. She set it in the center of the paper, folded the corners over the leather, and cut a strip of clear adhesive tape from the heavy iron dispenser on her desk. Screech! Snap! She pressed the tape down, securing the paper around the volume, protecting the pages from the dampness of the leather trunk waiting by the closet. This was her Monday afternoon routine. Every afternoon since she had made her quiet decision, she spent 1 hour organizing her personal library. She wrapped her notebooks, her reference manuals, and her personal correspondence, packing them away with the same geometric precision she used for everything. The faint, sweet scent of old paper, dried leather, and vanilla from the notebook pages rose into the cool air of the library, a quiet, dusty fragrance that felt like a collection of memories being slowly put to sleep. She reached for the next journal, but as she stretched her hand across the desk, her fingers brushed against something hard and uneven. On the center of her green leather blotter lay her law school diploma. It was no longer hanging on the wall of her small office corner. It had been taken down. The dark oak frame was splintered at the corners, and the glass face was spiderwebbed with a thick, jagged crack that ran directly through the gold seal of the State University and bisected her name, Clara Vance, Juris Doctor. The frame had not fallen. It had been laid face down on the desk, the broken shards of glass resting in a small glittering heap on her keyboard. Indirect interaction. Julian had entered her workspace while she was down in the laundry cellar. He had not yelled at her. He had not confronted her about the mortgage default or the frozen bank accounts. Instead, he had taken this silent, childish piece of her history, shattered it, and left it on her desk like a dead bird, a physical expression of his spite, a warning that if she refused to support his career, she had no right to her own. Clara looked at the shattered glass. Internal calculation. Julian wanted her to react. He wanted her to storm down the hall to his study, holding the broken frame, demanding an explanation. He wanted an emotional fight, a dramatic scene where he could vent his terror about tomorrow's deadline and blame her jealousy for his own violent behavior. If she confronted him, she would spend her remaining energy playing the role of his antagonist, giving him the attention and the emotional release he was desperately seeking. The energy required to clean the glass, remain silent, and continue packing, 5%. The energy required to give him his theatrical confrontation, 95%. Clara did not flinch. She did not look toward the hallway. She picked up the small brass dustpan from the fireplace hearth. With slow, measured movements, she swept the glittering shards of glass off her keyboard, watching them slide into the pan with a dry, metallic rattle. She dumped the glass into the metal wastebasket beneath her desk, the sharp, hollow clink-clank of the impact echoing through the quiet library. She took her diploma out of the broken frame. The heavy parchment was slightly wrinkled where the cracked glass had pressed against it, but the paper was whole. She folded it carefully into thirds, wrapped it in a clean sheet of tissue paper, and placed it in the center of the leather trunk, right next to her wrapped research journals. From the hallway downstairs, the front door opened and closed. Julian's heavy, uneven steps sounded in the foyer. He was returning from a late afternoon trip to the office, likely his final, desperate attempt to gather whatever physical files he could find to rebuild his case before Tuesday morning. Clara stood by her desk, listening to his movements. She heard the rattle of his keys as he set them down on the silver tray in the foyer. Then there was a brief, heavy silence. The silver USB drive was sitting in the center of that tray, resting directly on his heavy brass keyring. Through the open library door, Clara heard the faint, metallic clink of the keys being picked up again, followed by the slide of his leather briefcase's zipper. He had found the drive. He had not asked where it came from. He had not questioned the anonymous silver key sitting on his tray. In his desperate, exhausted state, he had simply assumed it was a backup his secretary had compiled, or perhaps a delivery from the IT department he had browbeaten earlier in the week. He had taken the poisoned apple. He had put it in his briefcase. The sound of his heavy steps began to ascend the stairs, but they did not stop at the library door. He walked straight past her room, his head down, his shoulders hunched, his bedroom door closing behind him with a sharp, heavy click. The house fell back into its deep, suffocating quiet. Upstairs, Eleanor's quarters remained entirely silent. Her mother had not come down since the confrontation in the cellar. The shame of her own unvarnished rage had locked her behind her own doors, leaving her to nurse her panic in the dark. Clara walked to the window of the library. She looked out at the gravel driveway below. The rain had returned, a steady, gray drizzle that turned the gravel dark and slick. The rhododendron bushes in the garden were heavy and black under the wet sky, their leaves drooping toward the earth. Tomorrow was Tuesday. The 48-hour deadline was over, and the stage was set. Julian had his polished shoes, his unedited brief, his cracked reputation, and the silver USB drive containing the fatal date. Clara closed the lid of her leather trunk. She pressed the brass latches down, the spring-loaded metal clicking into place with a sharp double snap. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dim afternoon light, her fingers smelling faintly of linseed oil, brass polish, and the cold, sharp scent of broken glass. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 4 p.m. Tock, tock, tock. The small brass key of the mechanical travel clock was cold and biting against Clara's fingers. She turned it slowly. Click, click, click. With each rotation of the key, she felt the internal resistance of the coiled steel spring tightening, storing its quiet, mechanical energy in the dark casing of the clock. This was her Monday night routine. Every Monday at 11:30 p.m., she wound the small brass clock her grandfather had given her. It didn't have a loud rhythmic tick. It hummed with a low, vibrating whir that was only audible if she pressed her ear directly to the metal. The air in her bedroom was cool, smelling faintly of the rain-damp cedar from the open window and the sharp chemical residue of the lye soap that still lingered on her scrubbed knuckles. A sharp, whispery scrape cut through the silence of the room. In the narrow gap beneath her bedroom door, a crisp, white envelope slid into her room, cutting through the bar of yellow light from the hallway. There were no footsteps accompanying the arrival. Julian had walked on the carpeted runner, his movements silent, leaving his message to do the talking for him. Clara stood up. She walked to the door, knelt on the floor, and picked up the envelope. It was heavy, made of high-grade ivory bond paper, bearing the embossed letterhead of Pendleton and Vance, LLP. Inside was a single 3-page document. Clara read the title in the dim light of her desk lamp. Notice of Petition for Emergency Removal of Trustee and Appointment of Receiver. It was a draft petition, signed by Julian as petitioner, accusing Clara of fiduciary neglect, mental instability, and willful interference with the administration of the estate. The language was fierce, aggressive, and highly theatrical. It threatened to drag her before the probate judge on Wednesday morning to strip her of her status as administrative trustee and freeze her personal accounts. Indirect interaction. Julian was using his professional leverage, his firm's letterhead, and the empty, frightening language of the law to terrify her into signing the trust release. He had left the document under her door in the middle of the night, hoping the sheer shock of a legal threat from her expert brother would make her break before Tuesday's 9 o'clock deadline. Clara sat back at her desk. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the paragraphs with the cool, analytical focus of a surgeon. Internal calculation. The petition was a disaster. In his sleep-deprived panic, Julian had cited Section 724 of the State Probate Code, a section that had been repealed 5 years ago during the statutory consolidation. He had misspelled the name of the estate's corporate registry, and he had failed to attach the mandatory affidavit of service. If he filed this document, the probate clerk would reject it on sight. It was a toothless, desperate bluff, written by a man who had forgotten how to draft a basic motion without his sister's quiet correction. She could write a 3-sentence reply, pointing out his catastrophic errors and watch him scramble to fix them. Or she could sign the trust release, end the financial freeze, and keep the peace in this house. The energy required to correct his petition and defend her sanity, 85%. The energy required to fold the paper, place it in her trunk, and let him walk into court with his empty threat, 5%. Clara folded the draft petition into thirds. She did not write a reply. She walked over to her leather trunk, lifted the heavy lid, and slipped the folded ivory paper next to her State University law diploma. She pressed the lid down, the brass latches clicking shut with a quiet, dull clack. Downstairs, the mechanical shuck, shuck, shuck of the library's laser printer finally stopped. There was a long, heavy silence, and then the sound of Julian's study door closing. The house fell into a deep, freezing quiet, the rain drumming a steady, indifferent rhythm against the window panes. Tuesday morning arrived at 7 a.m., the light through her window the color of ash. Clara dressed in her simple dark gray wool coat and her flat leather shoes. She did not make tea. She did not clean the kitchen. She stood in the foyer, her hands tucked into her pockets, watching the front staircase. Julian descended at 7:45 a.m. He was wearing his charcoal litigation suit, his shirt immaculate, his white collar perfectly pressed, and his court shoes shined to a blinding liquid mirror gloss. He looked exhausted, his face gray beneath his groomed stubble, but his jaw was set with a desperate, rigid pride. He carried his heavy leather briefcase in his right hand. He did not look at Clara as he reached the bottom of the stairs. He walked straight to the console table. His brass keys were gone. In their place sat the small, silver USB flash drive containing the modified joint appendix. Julian's hand hovered over the tray for a fraction of a second. His fingers closed around the silver drive, his thumb tracing the cold, smooth metal before he slid it into the front pocket of his briefcase. He zipped it shut with a swift, decisive slide of the brass zipper. "I'm leaving," Julian muttered to the empty foyer, his voice tight and hoarse. "Arthur is meeting me at the courthouse. The local news is covering the filing at 10. Don't touch my desk." He opened the heavy oak door. The morning air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and rain. He stepped out, his mirror-shined shoes clicking sharply on the wet concrete of the porch before the door slammed shut behind him. Clara stood in the quiet foyer, the vibration of the door slam still humming in the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 8 a.m. Tock, tock, tock. Clara walked upstairs to her bedroom. She picked up her packed leather trunk by the heavy brass handle. It was heavy, but her grip was firm, her knuckles white. She walked down the stairs, her slippers gone, replaced by her sturdy walking shoes. She did not leave a note for Eleanor. She did not leave a key. She opened the heavy front door, stepped out into the gray morning light, and walked down the gravel driveway, leaving the grand Vance estate behind her, silent, drafty, and entirely empty of her brain power. In exactly 1 hour, Julian would deliver the silver USB drive to the appellate court clerk. In exactly 2 hours, he would stand before the live television cameras on the courthouse steps, bragging about his game-changing brief. And in exactly 24 hours, the trap would snap shut. The thick, yellowed ceramic mug was heavy and chipped at the rim. Clara held the small metal spoon by its flat handle, stirring her black coffee in slow, clockwise circles. This was her new physical routine. At 11:30 a.m., she sat in the corner booth of the Terminal Diner, a small, low-ceilinged establishment 3 blocks from the regional bus depot. She stirred her coffee precisely 10 times, watched the dark brown whirlpool slow to a stop, and then tapped the edge of the spoon twice against the inner rim of the mug. The metal on ceramic clink clink was instantly swallowed by the low, greasy hum of the kitchen's exhaust fan and the wet, heavy hiss of traffic on the rain-slicked avenue outside. The air in the diner was thick, smelling of burnt lard, stale dishwater, and the sweet, chemically scent of the pink soap from the restroom. The red vinyl seat of the booth was cold, the internal springs creaking beneath her thighs every time she shifted her weight. Beside her on the floor sat her leather trunk, the brass latches dull under the flickering fluorescent light of the diner's ceiling. In the upper corner of the dining room, suspended from a rusted steel bracket above the cash register, was a small, dusty television screen. It was tuned to WNRT's midday local broadcast. The reception was slightly fuzzy, a thin pattern of horizontal static lines crawling up the screen, but the image was clear enough. The screen showed the granite steps of the Municipal Appellate Courthouse. Julian was standing at a small, temporary podium, a cluster of microphones from 3 local news affiliates gathered before his chest. He was wearing his charcoal litigation suit, his hair immaculate despite the gray drizzle, and his shined court shoes gleaming on the wet stone. Behind him stood Arthur Pendleton, his arms crossed over his heavy wool coat, his face set in a stern, patrician mask of professional satisfaction. A blue graphic banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Live, gavel and scale winner Julian Vance files key appendix in sterling liability appeal." This filing represents more than just a procedural step. Julian's voice came through the diner's tinny speaker, carrying that rich, practiced cadence he had used at the banquet. It is the structural spine of our entire appeal. I have personally spent the last several days refining every single page, every citation, and every date of this record to ensure absolute integrity. We have built an airtight wall, and we are confident the court will see the undeniable logic of our position. A reporter in the front row stepped forward, holding a microphone. "Mr. Vance, there have been rumors of financial difficulties within the estate. Will this filing affect your standing with the litigation committee?" Julian offered a smooth, dismissive smile, his teeth appearing brilliant and white against the gray background of the courthouse steps. "Our family's commitment to this jurisdiction has spanned 3 generations. Any administrative delays are purely technical and have already been resolved. My focus, and the firm's focus, is entirely on the law." Clara took a slow sip of her coffee. The liquid was hot, bitter, and tasted slightly of the metal pot, but it was warm. Internal calculation. The silver USB drive containing the modified joint appendix had been officially scanned and logged into the appellate clerk's database at 9:14 a.m. The clerk's automated jurisdictional software was programmed to run a chronological audit on all newly submitted records within 2 hours of receipt. It was now 11:45 a.m. The audit was complete. The automated system had already flagged the date on page 84 as October 15th, making the submission 91 days after the lower court's final order. Under the strict jurisdictional rules of the appellate division, a filing submitted even 1 minute past the 90-day limit was a non-curable defect. The court possessed no legal authority to extend the deadline, nor could they grant relief for clerical errors. The appeal was dead. The dismissal was mandatory, automatic, and with prejudice. Clara watched the television screen. As Julian began to answer another reporter's question, a young associate from Pendleton and Vance, a junior clerk named Miller, rushed down the granite steps from the courthouse doors. He was holding a black leather folder, his face completely pale, his eyes wide with a frantic, unvarnished terror. He bypassed the reporters, stepped directly up to the podium, and tapped Arthur Pendleton on the shoulder. Arthur frowned, leaning down to listen to the associate's whisper. Through the fuzzy audio of the broadcast, the microphone on the podium caught the rustle of the associate's coat, and then a faint, muffled gasp. Arthur's face went shockingly, completely white. His arms dropped to his sides, his shoulders sagging beneath his heavy wool coat. He grabbed Julian's elbow, his fingers digging into the charcoal sleeve of his suit with a sudden, violent intensity that made Julian stumble mid-sentence. "Arthur, what is it?" Julian's voice was captured clearly by the center microphone, his practiced smile faltering, his eyes darting to the camera with a sudden, nervous twitch. "We're live. Get away from the mic," Arthur whispered, his voice a harsh, dry rattle that vibrated through the diner's speaker. He reached out, his hand physically blocking the lens of the lead camera, his face twisted into a mask of pure, cold fury. "Julian, look at this." He shoved the leather folder into Julian's hands. The camera operator adjusted the angle, catching the edge of the printed white paper inside the folder. It was an automated receipt from the clerk of the appellate court. At the top of the page, printed in bold, red-inked block letters, was the status: filing rejected, jurisdictional defect. Appeal dismissed with prejudice. Julian's eyes scanned the page. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The blood seemed to drain from his face in one rapid, terrifying wave, leaving his skin the color of wet cement. He looked at the red text, then at Arthur's cold, dead eyes, and then down at his own mirror-polished shoes, which were now dark and spotted with the falling rain. "No," Julian whispered, his voice cracking, a tiny, high-pitched sound of pure infantile shock. "No, there's a typo. It's just a typo. Clara did the—" "You signed the certification, Julian." Arthur's voice was a low, venomous hiss, his mouth inches from Julian's ear, but the microphone caught every word. "You told the press you compiled it yourself. You told the litigation committee you didn't need a paralegal. The firm is off the docket. You've committed malpractice on live television." The broadcast suddenly cut away, the screen blinking once before returning to the warm, bright studio of the WNRT newsroom, where a startled anchor began to read a story about a local library renovation. Clara set her mug down. The clink against the table was quiet and clean. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a single $5 bill, and laid it flat on the laminate table beside her empty cup. She picked up her leather trunk by the brass handle, her grip firm and steady. She stood up, her coat brushing against the edge of the vinyl booth, and walked toward the exit. The bell above the diner door let out a small metallic ting as she stepped out into the gray, cold drizzle of the street. The air was fresh, smelling of wet concrete and the distant, clean scent of the river, entirely free of the suffocating beeswax, the silver polish, and the stale, bitter weight of the house she had left behind. She did not look back. She walked toward the bus platform, her steps quiet and light on the wet pavement, the sound of her own shoes matching the steady, peaceful rhythm of the rain. The wooden pushpin made a soft, hollow thump as Clara pressed it into the white plaster wall. She stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides. The bare parchment of her State University law diploma hung against the clean, whitewashed wall of her new room, entirely without a frame. The gold seal of the university was slightly wrinkled where the cracked glass of her old life had pressed against it, but the paper was whole, hanging straight in the morning light. This was her new physical routine. At 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning, she organized her new space. There were no heavy, dark mahogany desks here, no dusty velvet drapes, no silver-plated tea services that required hours of meticulous, invisible labor. Her new desk was a simple, flat pine table, positioned directly beneath a tall, unadorned window that looked out over a small, quiet courtyard filled with young birch trees. The room smelled of fresh paint, clean plaster, and the cool, damp fragrance of morning pine needles drifting in through the open window. In the center of the pine desk, her grandfather's brass travel clock sat perfectly wound, its low, vibrating whir the only sound in the small apartment. Clara sat down on the simple wooden chair. She pulled her personal laptop from her bag and set it on the pine wood. When she turned it on, the screen lit up with 22 notifications. Her phone, sitting beside the keyboard, was silent. She had turned off the ringer the night before, but the screen recorded 6 missed calls from Eleanor, 4 from Julian, and 3 from the administrative offices of Pendleton and Vance. She did not return the calls. Instead, she opened the automated transcriptions of the voicemail messages. The first was from Eleanor, recorded at 4:12 p.m. the previous afternoon. Her voice, usually so poised and condescending, was thin, gasping, and broken by long, shuddering breaths. "Clara, please, if you're reading this, call me," her mother sobbed, the high society mask completely gone. "The bank, they've sent a sheriff's notice to the house. They're foreclosing on the estate, Clara. They say because the trust payment defaulted and the tax delinquency wasn't cleared. The entire mortgage has been accelerated. Julian is locked in his study. He won't open the door. He's been in there since he got back from the court. Arthur suspended him, Clara. They've taken his name off the website. They're talking about a formal bar inquiry for malpractice. Please, Clara, we didn't mean those things in the cellar. We were just so stressed. You're a Vance. You have to save us." The next message was from Julian, recorded at 11:34 p.m. His voice was entirely flat, hollow, and shaking with a quiet, infantile terror. The arrogant, booming baritone that had filled WNRT's airwaves was gone, replaced by the trembling rattle of a broken child. "Clara," Julian whispered into the receiver, "how did the date get changed? I don't understand. Miller took all my files today. They've locked me out of the office servers. Arthur told me if I don't resign from the firm by Friday, they're going to file a formal complaint with the disciplinary board. He said I committed fraud. I didn't know, Clara. I swear I didn't know. Please, you have to tell them it was an administrative glitch. You have to tell them you made the typo. They'll believe you. If you don't, my life is over. Please, sis, please." Clara stared at the text on the screen, her expression perfectly serene in the pale morning light. Internal calculation. Julian and Eleanor were drowning in the very void they had spent decades constructing. They had treated her intelligence as a natural free resource, fully believing that they could insult her, strip her of her history, and threaten her with legal ruin, and she would still remain beneath them, holding up the foundation. If she went back now, if she signed the trust release, drafted a false confession to the Bar Association to take the blame for the date error, and spent her life working to pay off the estate's default, the family name would be preserved. Julian would remain a lawyer, Eleanor would keep her charity teas, and Clara would return to the dark library, her hands stained with the black tarnish of their silver. But she had already packed her trunk. She had already pinned her diploma to the white wall. The energy required to return to the cage, 100%. The energy required to let the law and the bank do their work, 0%. Clara opened a new email window. She addressed it to the Chief Compliance Officer of Vance & Associates Trust Management, carbon copying Eleanor and the firm's estate counsel. "Dear Mr. Sterling," Clara typed, her fingers moving in a steady, unhurried rhythm across the keys. "Please accept this letter as my formal, immediate resignation as the sole administrative trustee of the Vance Family Trust, effective today, Wednesday morning at 8:15 a.m. She paused, looking out the window at the birch trees swaying gently in the damp morning breeze. Under Section 4B of the Trust Charter, my resignation automatically suspends all discretionary payouts, including estate maintenance and office leases, until a successor trustee is appointed by the probate court. I have enclosed my final audit report for the previous quarter. You will find that several personal charges from Julian Vance have been flagged as non-compliant. I decline to certify these distributions. She read the email once to ensure the statutory citations were perfect. There were no typos. There was no emotion. It was a cold, surgical, and legally absolute document. By resigning, she was not just walking away. She was dropping the keys to their golden cage into the deepest ocean. Without her signature, the trust's capital was permanently locked. To appoint a successor, Eleanor and Julian would have to spend months in the probate court, the very court they had threatened to drag her through, where every single receipt, every personal charge, and every Bahamas vacation would be scrutinized by a hostile, court-appointed fiduciary. They would have to sell the estate simply to pay the legal fees. Clara moved her cursor to the top right corner of the screen. She clicked Send. The soft, digital whoosh of the outgoing mail was the only response. Clara closed her laptop. She stood up from the pine table and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the birch leaves green, clean, and glistening under the rising sun. Down in the courtyard, a small bird landed on a low branch, its song light, clear, and unhurried in the quiet of the morning. The brass travel clock on her desk struck 8:15 a.m. Tick, tick, tick. Clara took a deep breath, her lungs filling with the fresh, clean smell of the wet wood and the new plaster. She was no longer the silent architect of someone else's brilliance. She was simply Clara, whole, quiet, and entirely free. The white paper filter settled into the clean glass funnel of the coffee maker with a soft, static cling. Clara scooped 2 measured spoons of freshly roasted ground beans into the paper. The rich, earthy aroma of hazelnut and dark chocolate instantly blooming in the small, sunlit kitchen. She poured the hot water in a slow, steady spiral, watching the dark crust of the coffee rise, bubble, and slowly drip through the glass stem into the pot below. This was her morning routine now. Every day at 9 a.m., she made her coffee in the absolute quiet of her new apartment. There was no rush. There was no looming deadline, no frantic clatter of a typewriter from down the hall, and no desperate, demanding voices ringing through a cold, drafty estate. The steam rose, warming her face and leaving a clean, damp mist on the window pane. Outside, the rain had cleared, leaving the sky a brilliant pale blue, the green leaves of the birch trees in the courtyard glistening in the fresh light. A soft knock sounded at her door. Clara did not startle. She turned down the gas burner, took a clean linen cloth to dry her hands, and walked to the entryway. Sitting on the floor beneath her mail slot was a heavy, cream-colored document envelope. It bore the return address of Sterling & Associates, Trust Administration. Clara picked it up, walked back to her pine desk, and used her grandfather's brass travel key to slice open the paper seal with a clean, whispery hiss. Inside was a single, formal notification from the trust manager, accompanied by a copy of the final administrative order. Indirect interaction. Mr. Sterling had not called her. He knew, after receiving her brief, absolute resignation letter on Wednesday morning, that she had severed all personal lines of communication. He was contacting her purely as a matter of legal record, documenting the final, catastrophic collapse of the Vance estate. Clara pulled the document from the envelope and read the primary clause. Pursuant to Article 9, Paragraph C of the Vance Family Trust Charter, drafted and executed by the late senior partner Marcus Vance, in the event of the voluntary resignation of the named administrative trustee, should no qualified successor be designated by said trustee within 48 hours, the trust administration shall not freeze. Instead, it shall trigger an immediate, mandatory, and irreversible liquidation of all trust holdings, both real and personal. The document continued outline the cold, mathematical reality of her father's true design. The proceeds of the liquidation, following the satisfaction of any outstanding estate tax liabilities and mortgage delinquencies, are hereby transferred in full as a permanent endowment to the State University Law Clinic. The current occupants of the estate have been issued a 30-day notice of vacate. Clara looked up from the page, her eyes resting on the bare, unframed diploma pinned to her white plaster wall. Internal calculation. Her mother's cruel words in the cellar had been entirely wrong. Her father had not left her the administrative trust because he thought she was weak or too incompetent to survive. He had left her the trust because he had known with absolute certainty what Julian and Eleanor truly were. He had known that Julian would inherit his own vanity and that Eleanor would protect the illusion at the cost of their sanity. He had given Clara the ultimate, silent weapon of dissolution, not to trap her in their service, but to give her the exact moment to set herself free. She had calculated this outcome 3 years ago when she first reviewed the trust charter's hidden codicils. She had given Julian and Eleanor every opportunity to treat her with basic dignity. She had given them 48 hours of silent warning, and they had chosen to threaten her with a probate court petition instead. Now, the legal machinery her father had built had ground them to dust. The grand estate, the family sterling, the mahogany furniture, and the very trust funds they used to finance their snobbery were being sold to fund the State University Clinic, the very public institution Julian had mocked her for attending. A quiet, profound sense of peace settled in Clara's chest. The ledger was balanced. The silence had done its work. She opened her email inbox one last time. There was a single private message from Arthur Pendleton, sent from his personal address. Clara, the email read, "The litigation committee has officially accepted Julian's resignation. We are rebuilding our appellate department. I am fully aware of who actually drafted our landmark filings over the last 5 years. I would like to offer you a position as lead appellate counsel with full partnership track and your own name on the door. Please name your terms." Clara stared at the screen. She looked at the flashing cursor, then at the bright, clean room around her. She clicked delete. She did not want her name on a mahogany door. She did not want to build another partner's monument. Nor did she want to spend her days trading her silence for their prestige. Her mind was her own now, her future a blank, beautiful page. She closed her laptop, picked up her warm mug of coffee, and walked back to the window, watching the birds fly free across the blue sky. The screen fades slowly to a deep, cinematic black. The low, vibrating hum of the brass travel clock continues to whir in the dark, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that represents the cold, beautifully calculated march of justice. A calm, professional, and deeply satisfying narrator's voice begins to speak. Some people spend their entire lives chasing the spotlight, sacrificing their integrity, their family, and their souls just to stand in a glare that ultimately burns away everything they built. They believe that power is loud. They believe that brilliance is a show. But as the dust settles on the empty halls of the Vance estate, we are reminded of a much older, quieter truth. True power doesn't shout. It doesn't beg for applause, and it certainly doesn't ask for permission. True power watches, it calculates, and when the time is right, it simply walks away. If you found this quiet, devastating reckoning as deeply satisfying as we did, do not let this story fade into the silence. Welcome to Crazy Karma Stories. Here, we unmask the arrogant, we dismantle the entitled, and we watch the beautiful, slow-burning scales of justice balance themselves in the dark. If you want to ensure you never miss another masterclass in silent restraint, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below sharing your favorite moment of Clara's brilliant, icy cold revenge. Because in our world, every selfish action has an equal, opposite, and beautifully calculated reaction. Thank you for watching, and remember, keep your eyes on the shadows and let karma do the rest. Until next time.